Welcome to Mythic Slumber, where the legends of the ancient world become companions for rest. Tonight, we journey to the banks of the sacred river Sarayu, to a kingdom whose walls were raised in a time before memory, a place where Dharma, the eternal order of righteousness, was woven into every stone and every breath. This is the story of the Ramayana, the great journey of Rama, not told as a tale of triumph alone, but as a chronicle of exile and devotion, of forests dark and endless, of bridges built across impossible seas, and of a war that shook the foundations of the world. We will walk slowly through these ancient lands, through palace halls lit by oil lamps and jungle paths where tigers watch from shadow, and we will meet those who chose duty over desire, who carried the weight of oaths across lifetimes. Let your breathing deepen and your thoughts settle as we enter this realm of gods and mortals, of demons and sages, where every choice echoes through eternity. The night stretches long before us, and there is no hurry in the telling. If you enjoy drifting off to the legends of the ancient world, subscribing helps guide you back to these peaceful halls, and it allows me to continue bringing you these journeys into history and myth. Now let us turn our attention to the kingdom of Ayodhya, whose name means the unconquerable, a city that rose along the river's edge in an age when the world was younger and the gods walked more freely among men. The kingdom was ruled by the Ikshvaku dynasty, a line of kings stretching back through countless generations to Manu himself, the first man, who had survived the great deluge and from whom all humanity descended. The capital stood behind high walls of brick and timber, its gates carved with scenes of earlier kings, its streets wide and orderly, laid out according to principles both sacred and practical. Within the palace complex, courtyards opened onto gardens where peacocks wandered and fountains murmured day and night, their waters drawn from deep wells that tapped the river's hidden veins. The throne room was vast, its pillars carved from single logs of teak, polished until they gleamed like dark honey in the lamplight. And upon the throne sat Dasharatha, whose name meant he who could drive his chariot in 10 directions at once, a king whose strength had once been legendary, but whose years now bent his shoulders and silvered his beard. Dasharatha had ruled long and ruled well, guided by his ministers and by the wisdom of his chief counselor Vasishtha, a sage whose knowledge reached back through lifetimes, who remembered when the world was different and who could recite genealogies that stretched to the dawn of time. The king had expanded Ayodhya's influence through both diplomacy and war, forging alliances with neighbouring kingdoms and ensuring that trade flowed along the great roads that connected the cities of the plains. His treasury was full, his granaries stocked against famine, his armies well trained and disciplined. Yet for all his accomplishments, Dasharatha carried a sorrow that no victory could dispel, for he had lived many years without an heir, and the question of succession hung over his court like a shadow that no lamp could banish. He had 3 queens, Kausalya, the eldest and most dignified, Kaikeyi, the youngest and most beloved, and Sumitra, who moved quietly through the palace and troubled no one with demands. Each queen maintained her own household within the palace complex, attended by serving women and visited by the king according to ancient custom, but none had given him a son, and the years passed one after another like beads on a string while the kingdom waited. The absence of an heir was not merely a personal grief, but a cosmic imbalance, for in the dharmic order that governed the world, a king's duty was to ensure continuity, to pass the throne smoothly to the next generation so that the kingdom might endure and the people might live in peace. Without a son, the kingdom faced uncertainty, rivals might press their claims, alliances might fracture, and chaos might seep in through the cracks like water through a failing dam. Dasharatha consulted with Vasishtha and with other sages, performing elaborate rituals, making generous gifts to Brahmins, the priestly caste who interceded with the gods, and sponsoring the building of temples and the digging of wells for public use. He fasted and prayed, seeking guidance from the deities who shape the fates of men, and at last Vasishtha advised him to perform the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice, one of the most powerful and complex rituals known to the Vedic tradition, a ceremony that would take a full year to complete and would bind the gods themselves to answer his prayers. The ritual began with the selection of a perfect stallion, white as moonlight, strong and unblemished, which was consecrated with mantras and marked with sacred symbols drawn in vermilion and ash. The horse was then released to wander freely for 1 year, followed by a retinue of warriors and priests who ensured that no rival king captured or harmed it, for wherever the horse wandered, the land it crossed was claimed in Dasharatha's name, and any ruler who challenged this claim would face war. The stallion roamed across the plains and through the forests, crossing rivers and skirting mountains, while behind it Ayodhya's banners flew and its drums beat steady as a heartbeat. At the end of the year, the horse returned to the capital, and there on an elaborately prepared ground outside the city walls, the final sacrifice was performed, accompanied by chanting that lasted for days, by offerings poured into sacred fires, and by gifts distributed to thousands of Brahmins who had travelled from distant regions to witness and participate in this great undertaking. The smoke from the sacrificial fires rose straight into the sky, carrying the prayers and offerings upward to the realms where the gods dwelled, and the sages declared that the ritual had been performed without flaw. In the months that followed, the 3 queens conceived, each bearing the blessing that Dasharatha had sought for so long, and when the time came for the children to be born, the entire kingdom held its breath in anticipation. Kausalya gave birth first, to a son who was named Rama, and from the moment he drew his first breath, it was clear that he was no ordinary child, for his eyes held a depth that seemed to see beyond the visible world, and his presence brought a calm to those around him, as if a piece of the divine order itself had taken human form. Kaikeyi bore Bharata, a boy of fierce energy and bright laughter, whose devotion to his elder brother would become legendary. Sumitra gave birth to twins, Lakshmana and Shatrughna, who from their earliest days were inseparable and who would grow to become warriors of great skill and loyalty. The 4 boys were raised together within the palace, learning the arts of kingship, the skills of warfare, the disciplines of scholarship, and the principles of Dharma that would guide them through the trials ahead. They practiced archery in the courtyards, their arrows striking targets with increasing precision. They studied the Vedas under the tutelage of Vasishtha, memorizing hymns and philosophical discourses, and they learned statecraft from their father and his ministers, observing the administration of justice and the management of the kingdom's affairs. Rama grew to embody the ideal of a prince, not through arrogance or display, but through a quiet excellence that showed itself in every action. He spoke carefully, considering his words before giving them voice, and when he made a promise, he kept it regardless of the cost to himself. His skill with the bow was unmatched among his brothers, but he took no pride in it, treating his abilities as tools to be used in service of Dharma rather than as sources of personal glory. The people of Ayodhya, seeing him walk through the streets during festivals or watching him ride out on hunts, began to speak of him with a reverence usually reserved for sages or gods, and they looked forward to the day when he would sit upon his father's throne. Lakshmana, his closest companion, followed Rama like a shadow. Their bond forged not merely by blood, but by a shared understanding that seemed to transcend words, and it was said that Lakshmana could anticipate Rama's needs before they were spoken, could sense his moods even across distances, and would follow him into any danger without question or complaint. Bharata and Shatrughna, though devoted to their brothers, spent much of their youth away from Ayodhya, fostered with their maternal uncle in a neighbouring kingdom, a common practice meant to strengthen alliances and broaden the prince's understanding of the wider world. When Rama reached young manhood, an event occurred that would set in motion the long chain of consequences that would define his life and echo through the ages. A sage named Vishvamitra arrived at Ayodhya's gates, dusty from travel, his hair matted and his eyes burning with an intensity that made even the palace guards step back. Vishvamitra had once been a king himself, a kshatriya of the warrior caste, but through fierce austerities and years of meditation in remote forests, he had achieved the status of a Brahma Rishi, a sage of the highest order, and his power was such that even the gods regarded him with respect. He came before Dasharatha and made a request that no king could easily refuse, though it filled the old ruler's heart with dread. Demons, Rakshasas, who delighted in disruption and violence, had been troubling Vishvamitra's sacrificial rites, desecrating the sacred fires and making it impossible to complete the rituals that maintained cosmic order. These Rakshasas were not mere bandits or wild beasts, but supernatural beings of immense strength and cunning, and ordinary warriors could not stand against them. Vishvamitra asked that Rama, still young and untested in real battle, be permitted to accompany him into the forest and protect the sacrifices from these demonic assaults. Dasharatha's first instinct was to refuse, to offer his armies, to go himself despite his age, anything rather than send his beloved eldest son into danger. But Vishvamitra's request was not truly a request at all. It was a summons from fate itself, spoken through the mouth of a sage whose words carried the weight of universal law. To refuse would be to violate dharma, to place personal attachment above sacred duty, and such a refusal would bring consequences not just for the king, but for the entire kingdom. Vasishtha, seeing Dasharatha's anguish, counselled him to permit Rama to go, assuring him that the prince carried within him the strength to face whatever challenges awaited, and that this journey was necessary for reasons that would only become clear with time. Reluctantly, his heart heavy as stone, Dasharatha gave his consent, and Rama, with Lakshmana insisting on accompanying him, departed from Ayodhya at Vishvamitra's side, walking through the city gates and into the forest that stretched beyond, vast and green and filled with shadows that shifted like living things. The forest through which they travelled was not the tamed woodland near the city, but the deep jungle, where tigers watched from thickets, where elephants moved like grey ghosts through the undergrowth, and where ancient trees grew so thick that sunlight reached the forest floor only in scattered fragments. Vishvamitra led them along paths known only to sages and hermits, past clearings where ascetics sat in meditation, their bodies motionless as carved wood, past streams that ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and past ruins so old that no one remembered what kingdoms had built them. As they walked, Vishvamitra taught the young princes mantras of protection and power, sacred syllables that could turn aside weapons or summon divine aid, and he told them stories of the world's creation, of the gods and demons who had churned the cosmic ocean to obtain the nectar of immortality, of the cycles of creation and destruction that turned like vast wheels across incomprehensible spans of time. Rama listened carefully, absorbing not just the words, but the deeper truths they pointed toward, learning that the visible world was only one layer of a reality far more complex and interconnected than most mortals ever glimpsed. They reached Vishvamitra's hermitage as evening fell, the sky turning amber and gold above the trees, and there they prepared for the demon's attack. The hermitage was a clearing where several small huts stood around a central fire pit, simple structures of bamboo and thatch, built not for comfort but for the bare necessities of survival, while the sages pursued their meditations and rituals. Around the clearing, the forest pressed close, darkness pooling beneath the trees like water in a well. Vishvamitra and the other ascetics began their sacrifice as the stars emerged overhead, pouring clarified butter into the flames, chanting verses in the ancient tongue of the Vedas, the words rhythmic and repetitive, building power with each repetition. Rama and Lakshmana stood watch, bows strung and ready, arrows notched, their senses stretched to catch the first sign of the demon's approach. The night deepened, the fire crackled and snapped, and then from the darkness came a sound like thunder mixed with screams, and shapes hurtled toward them through the air, rakshasas dropping from the sky like stones, their forms twisted and terrible, limbs too long, eyes glowing with unnatural light, mouths filled with teeth that could tear flesh from bone. The battle was brief but fierce, a test not of endurance but of precision and will. Rama moved with a calm that seemed almost inhuman, drawing and releasing arrows so quickly that the air sang with their passage, each shaft finding its mark, each demon falling with a cry that echoed through the forest before being swallowed by silence. Lakshmana fought at his side, his own archery nearly as skilled, and together they formed a wall of protection around the sacred fire, ensuring that no demon reached the flames or disrupted the ritual. The demons, realizing they could not break through, retreated into the darkness, and the sacrifice was completed without further interruption. Vishvamitra, observing Rama's conduct in battle, saw not just skill but something deeper, a quality of attention and detachment that marked those who were more than merely human, and he knew that this prince carried within him a purpose that would unfold in ways neither the boy nor the kingdom could yet imagine. As dawn broke over the forest, grey light filtering through the canopy, the hermitage returned to its usual quiet, the fires banked to embers, the sages returning to their meditations. And Rama and Lakshmana, having passed their first true test, prepared to continue whatever journey fate had prepared for them. After the demons had been driven back and the sacrificial rites completed, Vishvamitra did not immediately return the princes to Ayodhya, as Dasharatha had hoped and expected. Instead, the sage announced that he would take them further still, to the neighbouring kingdom of Mithila, where King Janaka ruled with wisdom and fairness, and where an event of great significance was soon to unfold. The journey to Mithila took them across the plains, through villages where farmers paused in their work to watch the small procession pass, past wells where women drawing water whispered to one another about the young princes who travelled with the fearsome sage, and along roads lined with mango groves whose branches hung heavy with ripening fruit. The land was fertile here, the fields green with crops, the rivers full and slow-moving, and everywhere there was the sense of a world functioning according to ancient patterns, the seasons turning, the harvests coming, life continuing as it had for countless generations. Rama walked in silence much of the time, observing everything with attention but offering few words, while Lakshmana stayed close beside him, alert to every sound and shadow, his hand never far from the hilt of his sword. Vishvamitra, as they travelled, continued the prince's education, teaching them not through formal instruction, but through stories and observations woven into the rhythm of the journey. He spoke of the great sages who had walked these roads in earlier ages, of hermitages that had once stood in now empty clearings, of kings who had ruled justly, and kings who had fallen into tyranny and brought ruin upon their realms. He explained how Dharma was not a single unchanging law, but a principle that expressed itself differently depending on one's station and circumstances, how a king's Dharma differed from a priest's, how duties in times of peace differed from duties in times of war, and how the highest wisdom lay not in rigid adherence to rules, but in understanding the spirit behind them and acting accordingly. Rama absorbed these lessons with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything, asking questions that revealed depths of thought unusual in one so young. And Vishvamitra, despite his stern demeanour and the austerities that had hardened him like tempered steel, found himself growing fond of this prince who combined strength with gentleness, courage with humility. As they approached Mithila, the landscape began to change, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills, the villages growing larger and more prosperous, the roads wider and better maintained. Mithila was known throughout the region as a center of learning, a place where scholars gathered to debate philosophy and astronomy, where poets composed verses that were memorized and repeated in distant courts, and where the king himself was said to be as learned as any Brahmin, spending his days not only in administration, but in meditation and discourse on the nature of reality and the path to liberation. The city rose before them as they crested a final hill, its walls whitewashed and gleaming in the afternoon sun, its gates carved with intricate patterns of lotus flowers and sacred syllables, and above the walls, visible from a distance, stood the palace, a structure of many stories with balconies and terraces from which banners hung motionless in the still air. Guards at the gates recognized Vishvamitra immediately and bowed low, sending runners ahead to announce the sage's arrival, and by the time the travelers reached the palace courtyard, King Janaka himself had come out to greet them, his hands pressed together in respectful salutation. Janaka was a man of middle years, his beard beginning to show threads of grey, his eyes clear and thoughtful, his bearing that of one who carried authority without needing to assert it. He welcomed Vishvamitra with the reverence due to a great sage, offering water to wash the dust from his feet and inviting him into the palace with words of genuine warmth. When he saw Rama and Lakshmana, he paused, studying them with an intensity that went beyond mere curiosity, and something passed across his face, a flicker of recognition or perhaps premonition, before he composed himself and extended his welcome to them as well. The palace interior was cool and spacious, its rooms opening onto inner courtyards where fountains played and flowering vines climbed the walls, filling the air with fragrance. Servants moved quietly through the halls, bringing refreshments of fruit and sweet drinks, and musicians sat in an alcove playing soft melodies on the vina and the flute. Music meant to soothe rather than excite, to create an atmosphere of contemplation and peace. That evening, as they sat together in one of the palace's reception halls, Janaka told them the story that had brought Vishvamitra to Mithila at this particular time, a story that began many years earlier when the king himself was young and newly crowned. In the course of preparing a field for a great sacrifice, ploughing the earth in a ritual ceremony that symbolized the king's connection to the land and its fertility, Janaka's plough had struck something beneath the soil, and when the earth was cleared away, a child was found there, a baby girl lying in a furrow as if the earth itself had given birth to her. No one knew where she had come from, whether she was the daughter of some desperate woman who had abandoned her, or whether, as the priest suggested, she was a gift from the gods, born from the sacred ground itself. Janaka, moved by compassion and perhaps guided by intuition that this was no ordinary child, had taken her as his own daughter, naming her Sita, which meant furrow, and raising her in the palace as a princess of Mithila. She had grown into a young woman of extraordinary beauty, but beauty of a particular kind, not the flashy radiance that demanded attention, but a quieter perfection, a harmony of form and grace that drew the eye and held it, that made those who saw her think of dawn light on still water, or the first stars appearing in a clear evening sky. As Sita reached marriageable age, suitors began to arrive from kingdoms near and far, princes and kings' sons who had heard tales of her beauty and who sought her hand in marriage, hoping to form an alliance with Mithila, or simply to possess what everyone agreed was the most remarkable maiden of that generation. But Janaka, remembering that Sita had come from the earth in mysterious circumstances, and feeling that her destiny was somehow exceptional, had decided that she could not be given to just anyone, that her husband must prove himself worthy through a test that would separate the merely ambitious from those who carried true greatness within them. In his treasury, Janaka possessed a bow of enormous size and power, a divine weapon that had belonged to Lord Shiva himself, the great god of destruction and transformation who dwelt in the high Himalayas, wrapped in meditation and ash. This bow had come to Mithila generations earlier, entrusted to Janaka's ancestors by the gods, and it was so massive and so heavy that no ordinary man could even lift it, let alone string it and draw an arrow. Janaka declared that whoever could string this bow would win Sita's hand, and one by one the princes and king's sons had tried and failed, unable even to move the weapon from its resting place, returning home in shame and frustration. The bow had remained unstrung for years, and the question of Sita's marriage had hung over the kingdom like an unanswered riddle, when Vishvamitra arrived with Rama and Lakshmana. And upon hearing the story, the sage suggested that perhaps Rama might attempt what so many others had failed to accomplish. Janaka, looking at the young prince, saw youth and untested strength, but also something in his bearing that suggested hidden depths, and he agreed to allow the attempt, though without much hope, for the bow had defeated warriors far more experienced and physically imposing than this quiet boy from Ayodhya. The next morning, in a great hall within the palace, the bow was brought forth, carried by 8 strong men who strained under its weight, and placed upon a stand in the centre of the room. The weapon was beautiful in its terrible way, its wood dark as storm clouds, its curves suggesting coiled power waiting for release, its surface carved with patterns that seemed to shift and change as one looked at them, depicting scenes from cosmic battles and the dance of creation and destruction that underlay all existence. Rama approached the bow without hesitation, his footsteps quiet on the stone floor, while around him courtiers and priests watched in silence, curious but skeptical. He placed his hand on the bow, feeling its weight and balance, and then, with a smooth motion that made it seem effortless, he lifted the weapon as if it weighed no more than an ordinary staff. A murmur ran through the watching crowd, surprise and disbelief mingling in equal measure, but Rama's attention remained focused on the bow, turning it in his hands, examining the string that lay slack along its length. He took one end of the bow and began to bend it, muscles flexing, but without visible strain, bringing the arc around so that he could loop the string over the opposite end, and as he did so, the ancient wood creaked and groaned, protesting this treatment after so many years of stillness. Rama continued to bend the bow, increasing the tension, and just as the string was about to slip into place, the weapon shattered, breaking in two with a sound like thunder, a crack so loud that it echoed through the palace and out into the city, causing birds to rise from the trees in startled flocks and making people in the streets stop and look toward the palace in wonder and alarm. In the sudden silence that followed, as the echoes faded and the broken halves of the bow lay on the floor, Janaka rose from his seat, his face showing both awe and joy, for he understood that what had just occurred was no accident or simple demonstration of strength, but a sign from the cosmos itself, an indication that destiny had walked into his hall in the form of this young prince. He declared immediately that Rama had won Sita's hand, that the test had been passed in a manner beyond all expectation, and that preparations should begin at once for a wedding that would unite the houses of Ayodhya and Mithila. Messengers were dispatched to Dasharatha, carrying news of what had transpired, and inviting the king to come to Mithila with his court and his other sons, so that the marriage could be celebrated with the grandeur appropriate to such an occasion. While they waited for Dasharatha's arrival, Rama was permitted to meet Sita, and their first encounter took place in one of the palace gardens, beneath trees heavy with blossoms, whose petals drifted down like snow, settling on the grass and on the surface of a small pond where lotus flowers floated. Sita came accompanied by her attendants, young women who walked a few paces behind, giving the couple a semblance of privacy while still maintaining the propriety that custom demanded. She moved with the grace that comes naturally to those who have never had to think about how they carry themselves, and when she saw Rama standing by the pond, waiting with his hands folded and his expression calm, something passed between them, a recognition that went beyond the merely physical, as if two parts of a whole that had been separated were suddenly reunited. They spoke quietly, their words simple and unremarkable, the conventional exchanges expected at such a meeting, but beneath the surface formality, a deeper understanding was being established, a bond that would prove stronger than the hardest metal, more enduring than stone. Sita had grown up knowing that her marriage would not be ordinary, that the test of the bow meant her husband would be someone exceptional. But even so, meeting Rama, she felt a certainty settle over her like a blessing, a knowledge that whatever lay ahead, wherever this path might lead, she would walk it at his side without fear or regret. Dasharatha arrived within a fortnight, travelling with his wives, with Bharata and Shatrughna, who had been summoned from their uncle's kingdom, with ministers and priests and servants, with elephants and horses and wagons full of gifts, the entire procession stretching for miles along the road, raising dust that hung in the air like golden mist in the late afternoon light. The old king embraced Rama with tears of relief and pride, having worried every day since his son's departure that some harm might befall him in the dangerous forests or during the encounter with the demons. When he heard the full story of the bow and saw the broken pieces that had been carefully preserved, he understood that this marriage was not merely a political alliance, but something fated, written in the patterns of the stars before any of them were born. The wedding preparations consumed the city, transforming it into a festival ground where every street was decorated with garlands and coloured flags, where musicians played at every corner and dancers performed in the squares, where the air was thick with the smoke of cooking fires as feasts were prepared to feed the thousands who had gathered to witness the ceremony. The wedding itself took place over several days, following rituals that had been passed down through generations, each gesture and each syllable of the mantras carrying weight and meaning accumulated across centuries. Rama and Sita walked 7 times around the sacred fire, their hands joined, while priests chanted verses from the Vedas and poured offerings of clarified butter and grains into the flames. The fire, they were told, was the witness of their union, the element that consumed but also purified, that destroyed but also illuminated, and before its light they made their vows, speaking words of commitment and partnership that bound them not just for this life but for all lives to come, through whatever trials and separations might occur. At the same time, in separate ceremonies conducted simultaneously, Lakshmana was married to Sita's sister Urmila, while Bharata and Shatrughna were married to daughters of Janaka's brother, creating a web of family connections that linked Ayodhya and Mithila in bonds that politics alone could never achieve. The celebrations continued late into the night, with singing and storytelling, with gifts exchanged and blessings offered. And when at last the festivities began to wind down and the guests retired to their quarters, there was a sense throughout the city that something significant had occurred, that the world had shifted in subtle ways, aligning itself for events yet to come. The journey back to Ayodhya should have been a time of uncomplicated joy, the new brides travelling in covered palanquins, the princes riding alongside, the road behind them and home ahead. But as they travelled, moving slowly because of the size of the procession and the precious cargo of the new princesses, the sky began to darken, though it was midday, clouds gathering with unnatural speed, and the air grew cold and heavy with a pressure that made breathing difficult. The horses began to shy and stamp, their ears laid back, and the elephants trumpeted in distress, sensing something that human senses could not yet perceive. Then in the distance a figure appeared on the road ahead, blocking their path, and as it approached, those with knowledge of the ancient stories felt fear settle in their bellies like ice. It was Parashurama, Rama with the axe, a warrior sage whose name was spoken with dread throughout the land, an avatar of Lord Vishnu who had appeared in an earlier age to rid the world of corrupt Kshatriyas, warriors who had abandoned dharma and become tyrants. Parashurama had killed his own mother at his father's command, demonstrating absolute obedience to duty regardless of personal feeling, and then, driven by rage at the murder of his father by a king, He had gone on a rampage that lasted for years, exterminating the warrior caste 21 times over, filling lakes with their blood before his fury was finally spent and he retired to the mountains to perform penance. Now he stood before them, an old man whose eyes still burned with the fires of that ancient violence, and in his hands he carried his famous axe and a massive bow, another divine weapon, this one the bow of Lord Vishnu, a counterpart to the bow of Shiva that Rama had broken in Mithila. Parashurama's voice when he spoke was like rocks grinding together, harsh and unforgiving, and he addressed Rama directly, ignoring the king and all the others, saying that he had felt the moment when Shiva's bow shattered, had sensed the disturbance it caused in the cosmic order, and had come to see who dared to break such a sacred object. If Rama was truly the warrior that the breaking of the bow suggested, then let him prove it by stringing Vishnu's bow, and if he succeeded, then Parashurama would challenge him to single combat, for he could not allow a young upstart, no matter how promising, to claim martial supremacy without being tested by one who had walked the earth when the gods themselves still took active roles in worldly affairs. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy and inescapable, and for a long moment no one moved or spoke, the entire procession frozen in place as if time itself had stopped to witness what would unfold. Dasharatha, old and weary from travel, felt his heart constrict with fear for his son, for Parashurama was not merely a warrior, but a force of nature, a being who had transcended normal human limitations through his fierce austerities and his single-minded devotion to the destruction of unrighteousness. The king stepped forward, placing himself between Rama and the sage, his voice trembling as he spoke words of appeasement, explaining that Rama meant no disrespect to any sacred object, that the breaking of the bow had been unintentional, a consequence of the test set by Janaka, and that surely such a great sage as Parashurama would not hold a young prince accountable for following the customs established by another king. Parashurama listened without expression, his gaze never leaving Rama, and when Dasharatha had finished speaking, the sage simply repeated his challenge, his words cutting through the old king's pleading like a blade through cloth. Rama touched his father's shoulder gently, a gesture of reassurance, and stepped past him to stand before Parashurama, meeting the sage's burning gaze with eyes that showed neither fear nor defiance, but only a calm acceptance of what must be. He bowed respectfully, pressing his palms together in the traditional salutation, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly despite its quietness, acknowledging Parashurama's greatness and his rightful concern for sacred objects, but pointing out that if the sage truly wished to test him, then the test should proceed, for standing here exchanging words would accomplish nothing. Parashurama, hearing this response, felt something stir within him, a recognition perhaps of his own younger self, the prince who had once stood before his own father, awaiting a command that would change everything, and for a moment the hardness in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He held out Vishnu's bow to Rama, the weapon gleaming even in the dimmed light beneath the unnatural clouds, and told him to string it if he could, and they would see whether this prince was truly worthy of the reputation that would surely spread after the breaking of Shiva's bow. Rama took the bow with both hands, feeling its weight and balance, and immediately understood that this was a different kind of weapon from the one he had broken in Mithila. Where Shiva's bow had been ancient and brittle, its power locked away by time and disuse, Vishnu's bow was vital and alive, humming with energy that seemed to flow through it like blood through veins. He lifted it easily, much to the surprise of those watching, who had expected that even lifting such a divine weapon would require enormous effort, and he examined it with the focused attention he brought to all things, turning it slowly, running his fingers along its length, finding the points where his grip would be most secure. Then, in a motion so fluid it seemed like a single continuous gesture, he bent the bow, looped the string over the far end, and drew it back as if preparing to loose an arrow. the strings singing with tension, the bow's curve perfect and taut. The action took perhaps 3 heartbeats from beginning to end, and when it was complete, Rama stood holding the fully strung bow, its power contained but palpable, radiating outward in waves that made the air shimmer. Parashurama stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then slowly, deliberately, he lowered the axe he had been holding, letting its blade rest on the ground while he kept one hand on its handle. He told Rama that the bow recognized him, that Vishnu's own weapon had accepted this prince as a worthy wielder, and that this could mean only one thing, though it was a thing Parashurama had not expected to witness in his lifetime. He asked Rama directly who he truly was, for no mortal prince, no matter how gifted or blessed, could string that bow with such ease. And the breaking of Shiva's bow combined with this demonstration suggested that Rama was something more than he appeared, something that Parashurama, with his long experience and his connection to the divine, should have recognized immediately. Rama, still holding the bow, met the sage's eyes and spoke words that he had perhaps not fully understood himself until this moment, saying that he was Dasharatha's son, raised in Ayodhya, taught Dharma by Vasishtha, and that if there was anything more to his nature than that, it was not for him to proclaim, but for others to perceive and for time to reveal. The answer satisfied Parashurama in ways that a more elaborate explanation would not have, for it showed both humility and truth, an acknowledgement of mystery without false modesty or grandiose claims. The sage nodded slowly, and then he did something that shocked everyone present more than anything that had come before. He bowed to Rama, a full formal bow of the kind that juniors offer to elders or students to teachers, and he said that he could see now that his time was finished, that the purpose for which he had appeared in the world had been fulfilled, and that a new dispensation was beginning, one in which he would play no part. He asked only one thing of Rama, that the prince take the bow he had just strung and fire a single arrow from it, aiming that arrow at Parashurama's own store of ascetic merit, the power he had accumulated through lifetimes of discipline and austerity, for it was time for that power to pass to another, to be dissolved back into the cosmic order from which it had been drawn. Rama, understanding what was being asked and what it meant, positioned an arrow on the bowstring, drew it back until the fletching touched his cheek, and released it in a smooth, practiced motion, the arrow flying straight toward Parashurama and then dissolving into light as it struck not flesh, but the subtle body, the accumulated spiritual force that surrounded the sage like invisible armor. Parashurama stood still as the light washed over him, his form seeming to grow lighter and more transparent, and when the light faded, something had changed in his bearing, a weight had lifted, a tension had released. He told Rama that the debt was paid, that the bow was his to keep or return as he chose, and that Parashurama himself would now retire completely from the world, withdrawing to the mountains to await whatever final dissolution the universe had prepared for him. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away down the road, his figure growing smaller and less distinct until it seemed to merge with the landscape itself and disappear. And with his departure the unnatural darkness lifted, the clouds dispersing as quickly as they had gathered, sunlight returning to warm the road and the faces of those who stood there in stunned silence. The procession continued after a time, moving more slowly now, everyone processing what they had witnessed, and Rama handed Vishnu's bow to the priests who travelled with them, instructing that it be returned to whatever temple or guardian had originally been entrusted with its care, for he had no desire to keep such a weapon, understanding that some things were meant to serve their purpose and then pass on other than being hoarded as trophies. They reached Ayodhya as the monsoon season was ending, the last heavy rains giving way to clear skies and the first hints of the cooler weather that would follow. The city welcomed them with celebrations that lasted for days, the streets lined with people who threw flower petals and called out blessings, who wanted to see the new princesses and especially to catch a glimpse of Rama, whose reputation had preceded him. Stories of the demons defeated and the bow broken having been carried by traders and travelers until they reached every corner of the kingdom. Sita was received into the palace with all the ceremony due to the wife of the crown prince, and she took her place in the women's quarters, learning the rhythms and customs of her new home, forming friendships with the other princesses and with the serving women, gradually becoming part of the fabric of palace life. She proved herself to be not only beautiful but capable, managing the complex social dynamics of the royal household with grace, showing deference to the senior queens without diminishing her own dignity, and winning the affection of common people through small kindnesses and a genuine interest in their lives and concerns. The years that followed were peaceful ones for Ayodhya, a time when the kingdom prospered and grew, when trade expanded and alliances strengthened, when the monsoons came regularly and the harvests were abundant. Rama took on more responsibilities as his father aged, sitting in on councils, leading military exercises, travelling to outlying regions to hear disputes and oversee the administration of justice. He proved to be everything a crown prince should be, combining his father's strength with a wisdom beyond his years, and the people spoke of the coming reign with anticipation, looking forward to the day when Rama would sit upon the throne and guide them into what everyone assumed would be a golden age of prosperity and righteousness. Dasharatha, watching his son's development with pride, began to think about stepping aside, about passing the crown to Rama, while he himself still lived to witness it and to offer counsel during the transition, a practice not uncommon among kings who wished to ensure stability and to avoid the succession disputes that so often erupted when a ruler died without having clearly designated his heir. He consulted with his ministers and with Vasishtha, all of whom agreed that the time was right, that Rama was ready, and that the kingdom would benefit from having a young and vigorous king, while the old king remained available to provide guidance and historical perspective. Plans were made for a great coronation ceremony to be held during the spring festival, a time of renewal and new beginnings when the symbolism would be most auspicious. Invitations were sent to neighbouring kingdoms. Artisans were commissioned to create new royal regalia. Priests began the preliminary rituals that would sanctify the transition of power, and throughout Ayodhya there was an atmosphere of joyful anticipation, everyone preparing for celebrations that would mark a new chapter in the kingdom's long history. Dasharatha called Rama to him privately and told him of the decision, speaking with emotion of his pride in his son and his confidence that Rama would rule wisely and well, upholding the Dharma that had guided their dynasty through countless generations. Rama accepted the news with his characteristic humility, expressing gratitude for the trust being placed in him and promising to fulfill his duties to the best of his ability, to protect the kingdom and serve the people, to maintain justice and promote the welfare of all. But fate, as ever in these ancient stories, had prepared a different path, one that would lead not to a throne room but to a forest, not to kingship but to exile, not to the celebrations being planned but to years of hardship and loss. The instrument of this transformation would be Kaikeyi, Dasharatha's youngest and most beloved queen, the one whose wishes he had never been able to refuse, though she had rarely asked for anything beyond the ordinary comforts and courtesies due to her position. Kaikeyi had always been fond of Rama, had watched him grow with the same pride a mother feels for a gifted son, and when she heard of the planned coronation, her initial reaction was one of happiness. She had a trusted maidservant named Manthara, a hunchbacked woman who had served her since childhood, who had been her companion and confidant through all the years of marriage and motherhood, and it was Manthara who, driven by motives that the stories debate but never fully explain, whether jealousy or twisted loyalty or simple malice, planted the seeds of doubt and ambition in Kaikeyi's mind. Manthara came to Kaikeyi's chambers as the queen was preparing to join the celebrations, and with words carefully chosen to wound and worry, she suggested that Rama's coronation was not the joyous occasion it appeared to be, but rather a threat to Kaikeyi's own son Bharata, who was away visiting his maternal uncle and had not been consulted about this decision. Once Rama was crowned, Manthara whispered, he would naturally favour his own children over his half-brothers, and Bharata, who had as much royal blood as Rama, would be reduced to a subordinate position, perhaps even sent away or eliminated if he was perceived as a potential rival. The poison worked slowly, each word finding purchase in the fertile soil of a mother's protective instincts, and what had seemed impossible just hours before, that Kaikeyi might oppose Rama's coronation, began to take shape as a course of action, justified in her mind as protection for her son rather than as betrayal of the one she had always treated with affection. Manthara, seeing her words taking effect, pressed further, reminding Kaikeyi of an old promise that Dasharatha had made years earlier, a debt that had never been collected and that could now be called due. The promise dated back to a time before Rama's birth, when Dasharatha had gone to war against a regional rival and had taken Kaikeyi with him, for she was skilled in driving war chariots and had insisted on serving as his charioteer in battle. During one fierce engagement, an axle on the chariot had been damaged, threatening to collapse and leave the king vulnerable to enemy arrows, and Kaikeyi had noticed the problem and thrust her own arm through the hole where a linchpin had fallen out, keeping the wheel attached through sheer strength and endurance until the battle was won and they could withdraw to safety. Dasharatha, moved by her courage and the pain she had endured, had granted her two boons, two promises that she could claim at any time in the future, for any purpose she chose, and he swore that he would fulfill them regardless of what they might be. Kaikeyi, at the time, had simply accepted the promises without specifying what she might want, setting them aside like treasures to be claimed later if need arose. Now, Manthara suggested, was the time to claim those boons, to use them to protect Bharata's future, and to ensure that Kaikeyi's line would not be swept aside in the coming reign. Kaikeyi, her mind clouded by maternal fear and Manthara's manipulations, made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life and echo through history as an example of how even good people can be led astray by listening to the wrong counsel. She went to the Chamber of Sorrows, a room in the palace designated for queens who wished to express displeasure with the king, a place where tradition allowed them to sulk and refuse to speak until their grievances were addressed, and there she waited for Dasharatha to come seeking her. When he arrived, expecting to find her preparing for the celebrations, he found instead his beloved queen lying on the floor with her ornaments cast aside, her hair dishevelled, refusing to acknowledge his presence or to respond to his questions about what had upset her. The old king, panicking at the sight of his favourite wife in such distress, begged her to tell him what was wrong, promising to fix whatever problem had arisen, reminding her that she had only to ask and he would grant her anything within his power. Kaikeyi, her voice cold in a way he had never heard before, reminded him of the two boons he had promised her years ago, and she said she was ready now to claim them. Dasharatha, relieved that this seemed to be a simple matter of fulfilling old promises, readily agreed, asking what she desired, confident that whatever she wanted, whether jewels or palaces or new territories, he would provide gladly if it would return her to her usual cheerful self. Kaikeyi spoke her demands with a steadiness that suggested she had rehearsed them, had steeled herself against any hesitation or reconsideration. For her first boon, she said, she wanted Bharata to be crowned king instead of Rama, to receive all the honours and responsibilities that had been prepared for the eldest prince. For her second boon, she wanted Rama exiled from Ayodhya for 14 years, sent into the forest to live as an ascetic, removed completely from the kingdom so that there could be no question of rivalry or divided loyalties during Bharata's reign. The words fell on Dasharatha like blows from a club, each one striking with physical force, and for a long moment he could not speak or move, could not process what he had just heard, his mind refusing to accept that his beloved wife had just demanded the destruction of everything he had planned and hoped for. When he finally found his voice, it came out as a groan, a sound of pure anguish, and he fell to his knees before her, begging her to reconsider, to ask for anything else, everything else, his wealth, his kingdom, his own life, but not this. Not exile for Rama, who had done nothing to deserve such punishment. Not the elevation of Bharata, who was far away and had no part in whatever grievance she thought she was addressing. He argued, pleaded, wept, reminded her of how she had always loved Rama, how Rama had always been respectful and dutiful toward her, how this demand would bring sorrow not just to one prince but to the entire kingdom, to all the people who loved Rama and looked forward to his rule. Kaikeyi, her heart hardened by Manthara's poison and by her own fear for her son's future, remained unmoved, repeating her demands and reminding Dasharatha of his sworn oath, pointing out that a king who broke his promises was no better than a common liar, that Dharma itself required him to honour his word regardless of personal cost. The night wore on with this terrible scene playing out in the Chamber of Sorrows, the old king's pleas growing weaker as his strength failed, until finally he collapsed in grief and exhaustion, his spirit broken by the choice before him. Morning came and found Dasharatha still in the chamber, aged visibly by the night's ordeal. No longer the strong king who had ruled for decades, but a broken old man trapped by his own sense of honour, by the promises he had made, and could not now break without violating everything he believed about righteousness and duty. Word spread through the palace that something was wrong, that the king had not emerged from the queen's chambers, that the coronation preparations had been halted without explanation, and confusion gave way to alarm as ministers and priests gathered outside, uncertain what had happened or what they should do. It was Rama himself who finally came to investigate, concerned for his father's welfare, and when he entered the chamber and saw the scene before him, the king prostrate on the floor, Kaikeyi sitting rigid and cold, he immediately understood that something had gone terribly wrong, though he could not yet have guessed the specific nature of the disaster. Rama approached his father with concern etched on his face, kneeling beside the old king who seemed unable to lift his head or meet his son's eyes, and he asked gently what had happened, what grief or illness had struck so suddenly that the preparations for celebration had turned to mourning. Dasharatha could not speak, his throat constricted by shame and sorrow, could not bring himself to tell his beloved son of the exile that had been demanded and that honour required him to impose. It was Kaikeyi who spoke instead, her voice steady but devoid of warmth, explaining to Rama that the king had granted her 2 boons long ago, that she had now claimed them, and that by the terms of those promises Bharata would be crowned king while Rama must go into exile for 14 years, living in the forest as an ascetic without royal comforts or attendants. She spoke as if these were simple facts to be acknowledged, rather than a catastrophic reversal of fortune, as if Rama should simply accept what had been decided and prepare to depart without question or protest. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and everyone in the room held their breath, waiting to see how Rama would respond, whether he would argue or rage or refuse this unjust demand. Rama remained kneeling for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than shocked, and when he finally spoke, his words were measured and calm, showing none of the anguish that anyone else might have felt in his position. He said that if his father had promised these boons, then of course they must be fulfilled, that a king's word was the foundation of Dharma and could not be broken regardless of personal consequences, and that he would prepare to leave for the forest immediately so that the promises could be honoured without delay or complication. He asked only to take leave of his mother Kausalya and to say goodbye to Sita, and then he would depart, wearing the simple bark cloth garments appropriate to a forest ascetic, carrying nothing that belonged to his royal status. His acceptance was so complete, so free of bitterness or hesitation, that even Kaikeyi was momentarily taken aback, though she said nothing to dissuade him from this course, and Dasharatha, hearing his son's words, let out a groan that seemed torn from the depths of his being, a sound of such pure grief that those who heard it would remember it for the rest of their lives. The news spread through the palace with the speed of wildfire through dry grass, servants whispering to one another, ministers rushing to confirm what they had heard. The three queens gathering in Kausalya's chambers, where Rama had gone to inform his mother of what had transpired. Kausalya, who had given birth to this exceptional son and raised him with dreams of the great king he would become, felt the world tilt and shift beneath her feet, and her first reaction was anger, directed at Kaikeyi for making such a demand, at Dasharatha for granting it, at the universe itself for allowing such injustice. She urged Rama to resist, to refuse the exile, to fight if necessary for what was rightfully his, pointing out that he had the support of the people, the love of the army, the backing of the ministers, and that no one except Kaikeyi wanted to see Bharata crowned in his place. If he chose to claim the throne by force, she argued, it would not be rebellion but the restoration of proper order, the correction of a terrible mistake made by an old man manipulated by an ambitious wife. Rama listened to his mother's passionate arguments with the same patient attention he gave to everything, and when she had finished, he spoke gently, explaining why he could not do as she suggested. If he defied his father's word, he said, if he placed his own desires above the fulfillment of promises made by the king, then he would be violating the very dharma he was meant to uphold, demonstrating that personal ambition mattered more to him than righteousness. A king who broke his word was no king at all, but merely a man with power. And what kind of rule could he establish if its foundation was his father's dishonor? Better to go into exile, to live in the forest for 14 years, to demonstrate through his actions that dharma was more important than comfort or status, and then, when the term was complete, to return if that was still what fate intended for him. His words were spoken with such conviction, such absolute certainty that this was the correct course, that Kausalya's anger slowly subsided, replaced by a grief that was all the more painful for being mixed with pride in the son who could make such a choice without hesitation. Sita, when she learned of the exile, came immediately to Rama's side, and her reaction was not what anyone expected. She did not weep or protest or beg him to find some way to avoid the forest. Instead, she announced calmly that she would accompany him, that a wife's place was with her husband regardless of circumstances, and that if he was to live as an ascetic in the wilderness, she would do the same. Rama tried to dissuade her, painting a vivid picture of the hardships that awaited in the forest, the absence of comfort or safety, the constant dangers from wild animals and harsh weather, the complete lack of the luxuries she had known all her life. He reminded her that she had been raised in a palace, that she knew nothing of surviving in the wild, that the forest was no place for someone of her gentleness and refinement. Sita listened to all his arguments and then responded with logic that could not be refuted, saying that Dharma required a wife to share her husband's fate, whether it brought pleasure or pain, that her place was beside him not in times of ease, but especially in times of difficulty, and that she would follow him into the forest even if he refused to take her, walking behind him at a distance if necessary, but never abandoning him to face exile alone. The debate continued through the morning, Rama finding new arguments why she should stay in the comfort and safety of the palace, Sita countering each one with steady determination, until finally Rama recognized that her resolve matched his own, that she would indeed follow him regardless of his wishes, and that perhaps it was his own attachment to her safety rather than true dharma that made him want to leave her behind. He agreed that she could accompany him, though his heart was heavy with concern for what she would endure, and Sita immediately began to prepare, setting aside her silk garments and jewels, asking for the rough bark cloth that forest dwellers wore, transforming herself in appearance from a princess to an ascetic's wife. Lakshmana, hearing what had transpired, came to Rama with his own declaration, saying that he too would go into exile, that his duty as a younger brother was to serve and protect Rama, and that he could not remain in comfortable palace life while Rama faced dangers in the wilderness. Rama tried to dissuade him as he had Sita, but Lakshmana's determination was equally unshakable, rooted in a bond between brothers that went beyond duty to something deeper and more personal. The palace, which just the day before had been preparing for celebrations, now turned its attention to farewells, and the mood was that of a city struck by plague or invasion, grief hanging over everything like heavy monsoon clouds. The people of Ayodhya, learning what had happened, poured into the streets, gathering outside the palace gates, many weeping openly, some calling out accusations against Kaikeyi, others simply standing in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how their beloved prince could be exiled for no crime or fault of his own. Dasharatha, his health failing rapidly under the weight of his grief, wanted to accompany Rama to the forest's edge at least, to spend a few more hours in his son's presence before the long separation, and despite the protests of his physicians and attendants who feared for his weakened condition, he insisted on joining the procession that would escort Rama out of the city. The royal chariot was prepared, and Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana climbed aboard, dressed now in their simple bark garments, carrying nothing but a few basic necessities, looking more like wandering ascetics than members of the royal family. The journey through Ayodhya's streets to the city gates was slow and painful, the chariot moving through crowds of citizens who had come to catch a final glimpse of Rama, to call out blessings for his safety, to weep and wail as if they were witnessing a funeral procession. Old men who remembered Rama's childhood, merchants who had benefited from his fair judgments, mothers who had brought their children to see him ride past during festivals, all pressed forward, some trying to touch the chariot, others simply wanting to be near him one last time. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning down on the procession with merciless heat, and still the crowds followed, unwilling to let Rama go, hoping perhaps that some miracle would occur to reverse this terrible decision. At the city gates, where the walls gave way to open countryside and the road led toward the distant forests, many citizens declared that they would not return to the city but would follow Rama into exile, abandoning their homes and livelihoods to remain near the prince they loved more than comfort or security. Rama thanked them for their devotion, but gently insisted that they return to their lives, explaining that his exile would be lighter if he knew that they were safe and well in Ayodhya, maintaining their families and their work, keeping the kingdom strong for Bharata, who would soon be crowned. He asked them to show the same loyalty to his brother that they had shown to him, to support the new king and help him rule wisely, and he promised that after 14 years he would return if fate permitted, and that he hoped to find the kingdom prosperous and the people happy. His words were spoken with such sincerity and such concern for their welfare rather than his own, that many in the crowd felt their protest die in their throats, moved by his selflessness even in this moment of personal catastrophe. Gradually, reluctantly, the citizens began to turn back toward the city, though many stopped repeatedly to look over their shoulders at the dwindling chariot, and the sound of weeping followed Rama like a wave rolling slowly back to shore after the passage of a great ship. Dasharatha travelled with them as far as his strength allowed, the old king sitting hunched in his own chariot, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak through the constriction in his throat. At a crossroads several miles from the city, where the forest began to thicken and the road split into paths leading to different regions, Rama insisted that his father turn back, saying that the journey was becoming too taxing for someone in his weakened condition, and that they must part here so that the king could return to his duties and his remaining family. Dasharatha descended from his chariot and embraced each of them in turn, Rama and Lakshmana and Sita, holding them as if he could keep them safe through the strength of his arms alone. And when he finally released them, he seemed to have aged another decade, his face grey with grief, his hands trembling. He extracted a promise from Rama that the prince would return after 14 years, that he would not choose to remain in the forest beyond the term of exile, and Rama gave his word, sealing it with the same seriousness with which he had accepted the exile itself. Then, because lingering would only make the parting harder, Rama ordered the charioteer to continue, and they moved forward while Dasharatha stood watching, his figure growing smaller in the distance until the road curved and took them out of sight. They travelled for several days, moving eastward into regions less settled and more wild, passing through villages that grew smaller and more scattered as they proceeded, sleeping under trees when night fell, eating simple food purchased from farmers or provided by villagers who recognized them despite their ascetic garments and offered what hospitality they could. Rama had requested that Sumantra, the minister who served as their charioteer, take them as far as the Ganges River, the great sacred waterway that flowed from the Himalayas down through the plains, marking a boundary between the civilized kingdoms and the deeper forests beyond. When they reached the river at a point where its waters ran wide and swift, glittering in the sunlight like a ribbon of molten silver, Rama told Sumantra that this was far enough, that the minister should return to Ayodhya and report to the king that they had reached the forest safely and that Dasharatha should not worry about them. Sumantra protested, wanting to accompany them further, but Rama was firm, and eventually the minister bowed to his wishes, though tears flowed freely down his weathered face as he turned the empty chariot back toward the kingdom. They crossed the Ganges in a boat provided by hermits who maintained a small ashram on the riverbank, and as they stepped onto the far shore, leaving behind the last traces of their former life, the forest closed around them like a living thing, ancient trees rising on all sides, their canopy so thick that the sunlight reached the ground only in scattered fragments, dappling the leaf-strewn earth with patterns of light and shadow. The sounds changed too, the busy noise of human settlements giving way to the calls of birds, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth, the distant roar of a tiger claiming territory, and beneath it all, a deeper silence. The silence of a place where time moved differently, where the concerns of kingdoms and crowns seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the eternal rhythms of growth and decay, hunt and rest, birth and death. Rama led them deeper into this green world, following paths that were sometimes visible, sometimes merely intuited, moving with the confidence of one who had spent time in forests during his training, who understood how to read the land and find water, and identify which plants were safe to eat and which should be avoided. In time they reached the hermitage of Bharadvaja, a sage who lived on the banks of the Yamuna River, and there they stopped to pay their respects and to seek guidance about where in the vast forest they might settle for the duration of their exile. Bharadvaja welcomed them with the hospitality that sages offered to all visitors regardless of rank or circumstance, providing food and a place to rest. And when he heard their story, he expressed sorrow for the injustice they had suffered, but also recognition that their exile would bring them wisdom that palace life never could, that sometimes the forest taught lessons that could not be learned among the comforts of civilization. He advised them to travel further south to a place called Chitrakuta, a beautiful region of hills and streams where the land was fertile enough to support life but remote enough to provide the solitude appropriate to their exile. He described the place in detail, its caves suitable for shelter, its clear springs, its fruit-bearing trees, and the small community of ascetics who lived there in peaceful meditation, and he assured them that they would be welcome among those forest dwellers, that the community would respect their privacy while offering assistance if needed. Following Bharadvaja's directions, they travelled for several more days through the forest, the terrain gradually becoming more hilly, the vegetation changing as they moved into different ecological zones, until finally they reached Chitrakuta and found it to be exactly as the sage had described, a place of quiet beauty where nature seemed to exist in perfect balance, neither too harsh nor too gentle, challenging enough to require effort but bountiful enough to sustain life. They found a suitable location near a stream beneath a large banyan tree whose aerial roots formed natural walls and whose spreading branches provided shelter from sun and rain, and there Lakshmana, who had some knowledge of construction, built a simple hut using bamboo and large leaves, creating a structure that was adequate if not comfortable, functional if not beautiful. Sita arranged their few possessions inside the hut, establishing a small domestic space that brought a measure of order and familiarity to their new circumstances, while Rama explored the surrounding area, learning the paths and the water sources, identifying which trees produced edible fruit and where animals came to drink. As the days passed and they settled into the rhythms of forest life, something unexpected occurred. Despite the hardship of exile, despite the loss of everything they had known, there was a peace that descended upon them, a simplicity that brought its own kind of contentment. The endless obligations and formalities of palace life, the constant pressure of others' expectations, the weight of future responsibilities, all of these fell away in the forest, leaving behind something more elemental and more true. Rama spent his days in meditation and in maintaining their small settlement, occasionally hunting for food when their stores of fruit and roots ran low, but mostly living on whatever the forest provided without taking more than necessary. Sita discovered strength she had not known she possessed, learning to cook over an open fire, to gather forest produce, to mend their simple garments, to find beauty in their spare surroundings. Lakshmana stood watch, ever vigilant for dangers, his bow always strung and ready, his devotion to his brother and sister-in-law expressing itself through constant attention to their safety and welfare, anticipating needs before they were spoken, quietly performing tasks that would make their lives easier. The hermits who lived in the region came to visit, bringing gifts of roots and berries, staying to talk about matters of philosophy and dharma, treating Rama not as an exiled prince, but as a fellow seeker after truth. And in their conversations, Rama found the kind of intellectual companionship that palace life, for all its learning, had rarely provided. They discussed the nature of reality, the relationship between action and consequence, the paths to liberation from the cycle of birth and death, and whether the highest good was to be found in fulfilling one's duties in the world or in withdrawing from worldly concerns entirely. These were not abstract academic debates, but questions that touched on how one should live, what mattered, and what was merely illusion. And in wrestling with these questions, Rama felt himself changing, growing in ways that kingship might never have required or permitted. The forest became not merely an exile, but an education, a time out of time when the deepest questions could be explored without the distractions and demands that usually prevented such exploration. At night, sitting by their small fire while the forest darkness pressed close around their clearing, the stars visible through gaps in the canopy above, they would sometimes talk about Ayodhya, wondering how Dasharatha fared, whether Bharata had returned and been crowned, how the people were adjusting to the change in rule. Sita would ask Rama if he ever regretted his decision to accept exile, if he wished he had fought for the throne, as so many had urged him to do, and Rama would answer honestly that he had no regrets, that whatever Dharma required was what he must do, and that these days in the forest, hard as they sometimes were, had brought him a clarity about what truly mattered that all his years of preparation for kingship had not achieved. Lakshmana would sit slightly apart, keeping watch as always, but listening to their conversations, and occasionally he would add his own thoughts, usually expressing fierce loyalty to Rama and absolute conviction that time would prove the rightness of Rama's choice, that the 14 years would pass and they would return to acclaim and honour. But for now, time moved slowly in the forest, marked not by the complex calendars of court life, but by the simple progression of seasons, the monsoons and dry periods, the flowering and fruiting of different trees, the migrations of birds, and the breeding cycles of deer. They were cut off from news of the kingdom, living in a bubble of forest time, where the concerns of politics and succession seemed distant and unreal. And in that isolation they built something precious and fragile, a kind of family unit that functioned without the structures and hierarchies of palace life, based instead on mutual care and shared hardship. The exile that had seemed like a punishment began to feel, in quiet moments, like something else entirely, though what exactly it was, and what it was preparing them for, remained hidden in the mists of an unknowable future. While Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana settled into their forest life at Chitrakuta, far from the concerns of kingdoms and courts, events in Ayodhya had unfolded in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Bharata, summoned back from his uncle's kingdom where he had been staying, arrived to find the city transformed, no longer the vibrant capital he had left, but a place shrouded in mourning, its streets eerily quiet, its citizens moving about their business with downcast eyes and expressions of profound grief. He entered the palace expecting to be greeted by his father and brothers, perhaps to join in whatever celebration or ceremony had prompted his urgent recall, and instead he found the halls dim and silent, the usual bustle of court life replaced by an atmosphere thick with sorrow. His mother Kaikeyi came to him with news that she presented as triumph, telling him that he had been made crown prince, that Rama had gone into exile, and that the coronation that would make Bharata king was being prepared even as they spoke. Bharata's reaction was not the gratitude or joy that Kaikeyi had expected, but rather an explosion of anger and horror that shook the palace walls with its intensity. He demanded to know what had happened, how such a monstrous injustice had been perpetrated, and as the full story emerged, his fury turned specifically toward his mother, whom he accused of destroying the family and bringing dishonor upon their house through her selfish manipulation of an old promise. He told her that he wanted no part of a throne gained through such means, that he loved Rama as much as any of them did, and had never desired to supplant him, and that if she thought he would accept a crown purchased with his brother's exile, she had fundamentally misunderstood both his character and his understanding of Dharma. Kaikeyi, confronted with her son's rage rather than his gratitude, found herself trapped in a position where she could neither retreat nor advance, having committed an act that now appeared to all as simple treachery rather than the maternal protection she had convinced herself she was providing. The situation grew worse when Bharata learned that his father, Dasharatha, had died just days after Rama's departure, his heart broken by grief and guilt, unable to survive the loss of the son he loved most, and the knowledge that he had been the instrument of that son's exile. The old king had spent his final days calling out for Rama, weeping and refusing food, his mind wandering back through memories of Rama's childhood and youth, and in his last moments he had spoken of an ancient curse that had come home to roost, a debt from his own youth that was now being repaid. In his young manhood, Dasharatha had once gone hunting near a river at dusk, and hearing sounds in the darkness that he took to be an animal drinking, he had shot an arrow blindly into the reeds. The arrow had struck not an animal, but a young ascetic who had been filling water jugs for his aged parents, and as the boy died, he called out for his mother and father, who were blind hermits living nearby and dependent on their son for care. When Dasharatha discovered what he had done, he was stricken with remorse and went to confess to the boy's parents, and they, in their grief, had cursed him, saying that he too would die separated from his son, suffering the same anguish they now felt. The curse had lain dormant for decades, waiting, and now it had manifested in the worst possible way, with Dasharatha dying while Rama was unreachable in the forest, unable to perform the funeral rites that a son owed to his father or to receive his father's final blessings. The kingdom was left without a king, caught between an exile who was the rightful heir and a prince who refused the throne that had been given to him through treachery. Bharata, grappling with this catastrophic situation, made immediate preparations to journey into the forest to find Rama, determined to bring him back, to undo the damage his mother had caused, and to place the crown on the head where it rightfully belonged. He gathered an enormous procession, taking not just a small party of attendants, but essentially the entire court, ministers and priests, soldiers and servants, even bringing the three queens including Kaikeyi, whom he forced to come despite her protests, saying that she must face Rama and beg his forgiveness for what she had done. The procession that left Ayodhya was like a small city on the move, thousands of people travelling together, and word of their coming spread ahead through the forest communities, hermits passing news from one ashram to another until it reached Chitrakuta. Rama, learning that an army was approaching through the forest, initially feared that this might be some hostile force, perhaps sent by rivals taking advantage of Ayodhya's instability to make territorial claims, and he prepared to defend their small settlement, gathering his weapons and positioning himself where he could observe the approaching procession. When he recognized the royal standards of Ayodhya at the head of the column, his concerns shifted to confusion, unable to imagine why such a large party would come to the forest. And it was not until the procession came close enough for individuals to be distinguished that he saw Bharata at its head and understood that something significant must have happened to prompt his brother's arrival. The reunion between the brothers took place in a clearing near their hut. Bharata, rushing forward as soon as he saw Rama, falling at his feet in a gesture of respect and supplication, and the sight of his younger brother in such a posture, combined with the presence of the entire court and the absence of their father, told Rama that the news was grave even before any words were spoken. Bharata explained everything through his tears: the death of Dasharatha, the circumstances that had led to Rama's exile, his own absolute refusal to accept the throne, and his determination to bring Rama back to Ayodhya where he belonged. He begged Rama to return with them, to take up the kingship that was rightfully his, arguing that the boons Kaikeyi had demanded were void because they had been obtained through deception and manipulation, that no one in the kingdom wanted anyone but Rama as their ruler, and that the only way to heal the damage that had been done was for Rama to come home and restore proper order. The speech was impassioned and sincere, coming from a heart that held no ambition for power and no jealousy of his elder brother, only love and a desperate desire to set things right. The assembled court members added their voices to Bharata's plea, ministers explaining the administrative chaos that threatened without a clear succession, priests invoking dharmic principles that they argued supported Rama's return, even the three queens approaching one by one to beg him to reconsider, Kaikeyi among them now filled with remorse and begging forgiveness for the terrible mistake she had made. Rama listened to all of them with the same patient attention he brought to everything, his face grave as he heard about his father's death, tears flowing freely at that news, but his expression becoming more composed as Bharata laid out his arguments for why the exile should be abandoned and the throne claimed. When everyone had finished speaking and the clearing fell silent except for the sounds of the forest around them, birds calling and wind moving through leaves, Rama spoke with a gentleness that somehow made his words more absolute than any harsh decree could have been. He said that he understood their concerns and appreciated their love, that nothing would bring him greater joy than to ease their suffering and return to Ayodhya, but that he could not do so because his father had made a promise, and that promise must be honoured. The fact that Kaikeyi had manipulated the situation, the fact that Dasharatha had made the promise under duress, even the fact that the king himself had died of grief at the consequences, none of these changed the fundamental truth that a promise had been made by a king and must be kept, for if the word of a king meant nothing, then what foundation could there be for law or justice or any kind of social order? He explained that Dasharatha had granted 2 boons to Kaikeyi, that those boons had specified 14 years of exile for Rama and coronation for Bharata, and that until 14 years had passed, he was bound by Dharma to remain in the forest, regardless of personal desire or political convenience. To return early would be to demonstrate that he placed his own comfort above his father's honour, that he valued the crown more than the integrity that should characterize those who wear it. He told Bharata that the younger prince must accept the throne not as a usurper, but as the legitimate king designated by their father's command, that Bharata's duty was to rule Ayodhya well and keep the kingdom strong until Rama's exile was complete, and that when the 14 years had passed, they could revisit the question of succession, but not before. The reasoning was implacable, rooted in a conception of Dharma so rigorous that it allowed no exceptions for extenuating circumstances or emotional appeals, and those who heard it understood that Rama would not be moved, that his decision was as fixed as the mountains that surrounded them. Bharata, desperate and anguished, tried every argument he could conceive, pointing out that Rama's interpretation of Dharma was only one possible reading, that other scholars might argue differently, that circumstances had changed in ways that surely allowed for flexibility in how the original promise should be fulfilled. When these rational arguments failed to shift Rama's position, Bharata resorted to emotional pleas, speaking of his own inability to rule effectively without Rama's guidance, of the people's grief and their longing for their rightful king, of the damage being done to the kingdom with each day that passed in this state of uncertainty. He even threatened to remain in the forest himself, to refuse to return to Ayodhya, saying that if Rama would not come back to rule, then Bharata would stay here in exile alongside him, abandoning the kingdom to whatever fate awaited it, without either of them to guide it. This threat seemed to move Rama more than the other arguments had, not because it changed his mind about what Dharma required, but because he recognized that Bharata's threat was sincere and that such an outcome would serve no one's interests. After long hours of debate that continued through the afternoon and into the evening, with the entire assembly watching and waiting to see what would be decided, Rama proposed a compromise that acknowledged Bharata's position while maintaining the essential terms of the exile. He removed his sandals, the simple wooden footwear that he used for walking on the forest paths, and he gave them to Bharata, telling his brother to take the sandals back to Ayodhya and place them on the throne as symbols of Rama's authority. Bharata should rule the kingdom as regent, making decisions and performing all the functions of kingship, but he should do so in Rama's name, administering the realm on behalf of the rightful king who was temporarily absent. The sandals on the throne would serve as a constant reminder that Bharata's authority was derivative, that he ruled not in his own right, but as a proxy for Rama, and when the 14 years were complete, Rama would return to claim both his sandals and his throne. This arrangement satisfied the requirements of Dharma, honouring Dasharatha's boons while also ensuring that the kingdom would have effective leadership during Rama's absence. Bharata accepted the compromise with reluctance, understanding that this was the best outcome he could achieve given Rama's unwavering commitment to completing the exile. But he added his own conditions to the arrangement. He declared that he would not wear royal garments or ornaments during the 14 years, that he would dress in simple clothes similar to what Rama wore, and would live austerely, maintaining the outer forms of kingship only because duty required it. He would not occupy the palace, but would live in a small settlement outside the capital, governing from there while keeping Rama's sandals beside him always as a reminder of whose authority he was exercising. He vowed that if Rama did not return at the end of 14 years, he would conclude that something had happened to prevent that return, and in that case he would perform self-immolation, ending his own life rather than continuing to occupy a position that was not rightfully his. The vow was dramatic but sincere, expressing Bharata's character as clearly as Rama's acceptance of exile expressed his, two brothers each demonstrating through different means their commitment to Dharma as they understood it. The great procession prepared to return to Ayodhya, but before they left, there was the matter of Dasharatha's funeral rites, which had been delayed because a son must perform them, and Rama had been unreachable until now. They constructed a funeral pyre beside the river, building it according to ancient specifications with fragrant woods arranged in precise geometric patterns, and there they placed Dasharatha's body, which had been preserved through the journey from Ayodhya. Rama, as the eldest son, performed the rituals that would release his father's spirit to continue its journey through whatever realms awaited beyond death, circling the pyre with offerings, chanting verses from the Vedas, and finally lighting the flames that would consume the physical form and free the subtle essence. As the fire rose high, its smoke climbing into the evening sky, Rama stood watching with tears streaming down his face, grieving not just for his father, but for all that had been lost, the innocence of his youth, the certainty of his expected future, the simplicity of a world where duty and desire had seemed to align rather than conflict. After the ashes had cooled and been consigned to the river in the final ritual of dispersion, after the mourning period had been observed with its prescribed austerities and offerings, the procession finally departed, leaving Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana alone once more in their forest clearing. The departure was slow and painful, Bharata looking back repeatedly as the distance increased, and it was said that he wept the entire journey back to Ayodhya, clutching Rama's sandals to his chest like a talisman. When he reached the capital, he refused to enter the main city, but established himself in a village called Nandigrama, just outside the walls, and from there he governed the kingdom for 14 years, living simply, consulting with ministers, rendering judgments, and managing the affairs of state while always making clear that he acted only as Rama's representative, that every decision was made in the name of the true king who would one day return. Back in Chitrakuta, Rama and his companions found that the visit had disrupted the peace they had established, that the clearing which had felt secluded and safe now seemed exposed, too close to the paths that connected the forest to the settled kingdoms. They decided to move deeper into the wilderness, to find a more remote location where they were less likely to be discovered by well-meaning visitors or others who might seek them out. They travelled south and east, deeper into the Dandaka forest, a vast region that covered much of central India in that ancient time, a place of immense old trees and thick undergrowth, of rivers that ran swift and cold from distant mountains, and of communities of hermits who had retreated from the world to pursue spiritual practices in solitude. The forest was also home to Rakshasas, the demons who had troubled Vishvamitra's sacrifices in Rama's youth, beings of supernatural power and often malevolent intent who preyed on travellers and disrupted the meditations of sages. As they journeyed through the Dandaka forest, they visited several ashrams, staying briefly with different communities of hermits, learning about the various paths to liberation that different sages advocated, and occasionally hearing complaints about Rakshasas who had killed forest dwellers or desecrated sacred sites. The hermits asked Rama, knowing his skill as a warrior, to protect them from these demons, and he agreed, taking it upon himself to rid the forest of those Rakshasas who actively threatened peaceful communities. This was not hunting for sport or killing for pleasure, but a measured response to genuine threats, undertaken only when necessary to protect those who could not protect themselves. Lakshmana fought beside him in these encounters, the two brothers moving through the forest like avenging spirits, their arrows never missing their marks, and gradually the Dandaka forest became safer for those who lived there in pursuit of wisdom and peace. They eventually settled at a place called Panchavati, a beautiful location near the Godavari River where 5 great banyan trees grew in a natural circle, their interlocking branches forming a kind of cathedral ceiling open to the sky. Here Lakshmana built another hut, larger and more comfortable than the one at Chitrakuta, using skills he had developed and materials that the forest provided in abundance. They established routines similar to those they had followed before, gathering forest produce, maintaining their simple dwelling, spending time in meditation and study, and receiving occasional visits from passing sages who stopped to share news and philosophical discussions. Years passed in this way, seasons turning one into another, the monsoons coming with their torrential rains and the dry periods following with their dust and heat. And through it all, they remained in the forest, maintaining their exile, keeping faith with the promise that had sent them there. The peace of Panchavati was not destined to last forever, though for a time it seemed they had found a place where they could complete the remaining years of exile without further incident. They had been there nearly 10 years, the midpoint of their 14-year term, and had begun to think ahead to the eventual return to Ayodhya, to wonder what they would find when they went back, and whether the kingdom would still remember them, or whether they would have to rebuild relationships that had frayed during the long absence. Sita, who had adapted to forest life with remarkable resilience, sometimes spoke wistfully of seeing her father Janaka again, of meeting any children Bharata might have had in the intervening years, of simple pleasures like sleeping under a roof that did not leak, and wearing garments that had been properly dyed and finished. Rama would listen to these musings with a gentle smile, understanding that she was not complaining, but simply expressing natural human desires for comfort and connection. And he would promise her that when they returned, they would make up for the years of hardship, though both of them knew that some experiences changed a person in ways that could not be undone by simply returning to earlier circumstances. Lakshmana, who had never complained about the exile, and who seemed if anything to prefer the simple clarity of forest life to the complexities of palace politics, nonetheless showed signs of restlessness as the years accumulated, a tension in his bearing that suggested he felt they were marking time, waiting for something without knowing what that something might be. He ranged further from their settlement on his hunting expeditions, sometimes staying away for days at a time. And when he returned, he would report seeing signs of Rakshasa activity in the deeper parts of the forest, tracks and traces that suggested some of the demons were organizing in ways that might eventually pose a threat. Rama took these reports seriously, but did not yet act on them, reluctant to start conflicts that might be avoided, preferring to maintain the defensive posture they had adopted rather than seeking out confrontations. It was a reasonable strategy given their circumstances, but it would prove inadequate to the challenge that was already moving toward them through the forest, drawn by reports of a prince and his beautiful wife living in a simple hut beside the Godavari, a temptation too great for certain kinds of beings to resist. The danger that had been gathering in the shadows of the Dandaka forest finally revealed itself one afternoon when Rama and Lakshmana were away from the hut, checking snares they had set for game, leaving Sita alone for what they expected would be a brief interval. A Rakshasa woman named Shurpanaka, whose name meant she who has fingernails like winnowing fans, came upon their settlement and saw Sita sitting outside the hut, engaged in some small domestic task, her beauty undiminished by years of forest life, her movements graceful and serene. Shurpanaka was the sister of Ravana, the great demon king who ruled the island kingdom of Lanka, far to the south, a being of immense power and learning who had through long austerities gained boons from the gods that made him nearly invincible. She herself was no ordinary Rakshasa, but a creature of considerable power, able to change her form at will, to appear as a beautiful woman or to reveal her true nature, which was monstrous and terrifying. When Shurpanaka first saw Sita, she was struck by a jealous rage that such beauty should belong to a mere human woman living in a forest hut. And when she saw Rama and Lakshmana returning, two handsome princes in their prime, despite their ascetic garments and forest-dwelling lives, her rage transformed into desire. She approached them in the guise of a beautiful woman, speaking honeyed words of attraction, offering herself to Rama and suggesting that he abandon his mortal wife for a partner who could offer him powers and pleasures beyond human capacity. Rama, recognizing immediately that this was no human woman but some kind of supernatural being in disguise, responded with courtesy but firm refusal, explaining that he was bound by marriage vows and that his heart belonged entirely to Sita. Shurpanakha, unused to rejection and inflamed by the refusal, turned her attention to Lakshmana, making similar overtures, and when he too rejected her with words that were less courteous than his brother's, edged with mockery and disdain, her rage boiled over into action. She dropped her beautiful disguise and revealed her true form, a creature with extended fangs and claws like razors, and she lunged towards Sita, intending to kill the woman who possessed what Shurpanakha could not have, the love and devotion of these exceptional men. Lakshmana, who had been watching her with growing wariness, moved with the speed that years of forest life had honed, intercepting her attack, and in the struggle that followed, he drew his sword and mutilated her, cutting off her nose and ears in a disfiguring punishment that was traditionally applied to those who violated sacred boundaries or committed certain categories of offences. Shurpanakha fled, screaming in pain and humiliation, blood streaming from her wounds, and she ran deeper into the forest toward the stronghold where her brother Kara commanded a large force of Rakshasas, demons who served Ravana's interests in this region, and who maintained order among the various Rakshasa clans that dwelled in the Dandaka forest. Kara, seeing his sister's condition, and hearing her tale of the humans who had dared to strike a member of Ravana's family, was filled with fury and immediately assembled his forces. 14,000 Rakshasas armed and ready for battle, creatures of varying types and powers, but all loyal to their commander and eager to avenge the insult to their kind. They marched on Panchavati like an army going to war, the sound of their approach audible from a great distance, the ground trembling under their feet, animals fleeing before them in terror. Rama, understanding that this was no longer a matter of defending against isolated attacks, but a full military engagement, made preparations that showed both his tactical skill and his consideration for those who depended on him. He instructed Lakshmana to take Sita to a cave some distance away, a secure location where she would be protected from the coming battle, and then he positioned himself in a defensive position where the terrain would give him advantage against superior numbers. The battle that followed was unlike anything the forest had witnessed in living memory. A single warrior standing against an army of supernatural beings, and yet the outcome was never in doubt, for Rama fought with a skill and power that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. He used the terrain expertly, forcing the Rakshasas to approach through narrow passages where their numbers were no advantage, and his arrows flew with such speed and accuracy that it seemed impossible for one man to shoot so many, each shaft finding its mark, each demon falling before they could close to striking distance. The engagement lasted from afternoon into evening, the shadows lengthening across the forest floor as bodies accumulated, and by the time darkness fell, Kara and all his forces lay dead, the entire army destroyed by a single opponent who stood among the fallen, his bow still drawn, his breathing steady, untouched and victorious. Shurpanakha, who had witnessed the battle from hiding, understanding now that she had encountered not merely skilled warriors, but something far more dangerous, fled southward toward Lanka to carry news to Ravana of what had transpired. She travelled for many days, crossing the length of the Indian subcontinent, passing through kingdoms and forests, over mountains and across rivers, until she reached the southern coast where the island of Lanka lay just beyond the strait, visible in the distance like a jewel set in the ocean. Lanka was a magnificent city, its walls built of gold that gleamed in the sunlight, its palaces and temples constructed with such artistry that even the gods were said to admire them. For Ravana, despite his demonic nature, was a being of refined tastes and considerable learning, a master of the Vedas and an accomplished musician who played the veena with skill that moved listeners to tears. He ruled his kingdom with an iron hand, but also with intelligence and administrative competence that made Lanka prosperous and powerful, feared by neighboring realms and respected even by many who opposed him. Ravana sat in his council chamber when Shurpanakha arrived, surrounded by his advisors and generals, discussing matters of state and military strategy, for he was perpetually expanding his influence, sending expeditions to distant lands, demanding tribute from smaller kingdoms, building an empire that stretched across much of the southern seas. He was a being of terrible appearance and magnificent presence, with 10 heads arranged around his shoulders, each face expressing a different aspect of his nature: wisdom and cruelty, desire and wrath, and 20 arms that could wield weapons with coordinated precision that no ordinary warrior could match. His power had been earned through intense austerities performed over many years, standing on one foot for centuries, offering parts of his own body to the gods in sacrifice, until finally Brahma the creator had appeared and offered him boons, near invincibility against gods and demons, though in his arrogance Ravana had not thought to ask for protection against humans, considering them too weak to pose any threat. Shurpanakha burst into the council chamber with her wounds still raw, telling her story in fragments, speaking of the beautiful woman she had found in the forest, of the 2 warriors who had humiliated her, and most importantly, of the slaughter of Kara's entire army by a single human who fought like a god. Ravana listened with growing interest, his multiple faces showing various reactions, some angry at the insult to his family, others intrigued by the description of warriors of such exceptional skill, and one face, the one that governed his deepest desires, becoming thoughtful as Shurpanakha described Sita's beauty in terms calculated to inflame his interest. She painted a picture of a woman without equal in the 3 worlds, whose grace and loveliness surpassed even the celestial maidens who danced in Indra's heaven, and she suggested that such a woman was wasted on a mere human prince living in exile, that she would be more appropriately placed in the palace of the greatest king in the world, surrounded by luxury and devotion befitting her extraordinary nature. The seed once planted grew quickly in Ravana's mind, for he was not merely powerful and learned, but also consumed by appetites that no amount of indulgence could fully satisfy, a collector of rare and beautiful things who saw in Sita not a person but a prize to be acquired. He had many wives already, queens and concubines taken from various kingdoms through conquest or diplomacy or simple abduction, but the description of Sita stirred something in him, a desire that was part genuine attraction and part the simple urge to possess what others valued. He dismissed his advisors and sat alone in thought for some time, considering how to proceed, for even Ravana understood that there were limits to what could be accomplished through direct force, that some goals required subtlety and deception. He called for Maricha, an old Rakshasa of great cunning who had encountered Rama before, and who had barely escaped with his life from that meeting, and he laid out a plan that would require Maricha's particular talents and his ability to assume forms that could deceive even careful observers. Maricha, when he heard what Ravana wanted, tried desperately to dissuade him, explaining that Rama was no ordinary human, but almost certainly an avatar of Vishnu himself, a divine being incarnated in mortal form for purposes that only the gods understood, and that attempting to harm him or take what was his would bring consequences too terrible to contemplate. He spoke from personal experience, describing the encounter years earlier when he and another Rakshasa named Subahu had attempted to disrupt Vishvamitra's sacrifices, and how Rama, barely more than a boy at the time, had struck them with arrows that sent them flying hundreds of miles across the sky to land, battered and broken, at the edge of the world. Maricha had learned from that experience to avoid Rama at all costs, to live quietly and without drawing attention, and the thought of deliberately provoking such a being filled him with a dread that went beyond normal fear. Ravana, however, was not interested in caution or wisdom. Convinced of his own invincibility through the boons he had received, and he made clear to Maricha that refusal was not an option, that if the old Rakshasa would not help willingly, he would be compelled through force or curse. Maricha, recognizing that he was trapped between certain death for refusing Ravana and probable death for helping him, chose the option that at least offered a small chance of survival and agreed to participate in the scheme. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness, relying on the fact that Rama and Lakshmana, for all their skills and vigilance, were still bound by human affections and the codes of behavior they had been raised to honor. Maricha would transform himself into a magnificent deer, golden in color with jewels seeming to hang from its antlers, a creature so beautiful and otherworldly that no one who saw it could resist the desire to possess it, and he would appear near Panchavati, drawing Rama away from the hut in pursuit, while Ravana seized the opportunity to approach Sita when she was protected only by Lakshmana. They travelled north together, Ravana and Maricha, making the journey that Shurpanakha had made in reverse. And when they reached the vicinity of Panchavati, Maricha assumed the form of the golden deer and began to graze in clearings where Sita would be likely to see him during her daily routines. The plan worked exactly as Ravana had anticipated, for one morning Sita glimpsed the deer and was immediately captivated by its beauty, calling for Rama and Lakshmana to come see this marvel that seemed to belong more to myth than to the natural world. She asked Rama if he might capture the deer alive so that they could keep it near their hut, and if that proved impossible, then at least to obtain its hide, which would make a beautiful garment or blanket. Lakshmana, looking at the deer with a hunter's eye, felt immediate suspicion, noting that its appearance was too perfect, too deliberate, and he warned Rama that this might be a Rakshasa in disguise, a trap meant to separate them and create vulnerability. Rama acknowledged Lakshmana's concerns, but decided to pursue the deer nonetheless, partly because Sita had asked him, and he was reluctant to refuse her such a small request after all the hardships she had endured without complaint, and partly because he calculated that even if this was a trap, he could handle whatever threat emerged. He instructed Lakshmana to remain with Sita, to guard her carefully and not leave her side for any reason until he returned, and then he set off into the forest after the deer, which bounded away as he approached, always staying just out of reach, leading him deeper into the wilderness and further from the hut. The chase continued for hours, Rama pursuing with determination while Maricha in his deer form fled with growing desperation, knowing that when this game ended, his own death was all but certain. At last, when they were far enough from Panchavati that Ravana's part of the plan could proceed, Maricha allowed Rama to shoot him, the arrow piercing his heart, and as he died he resumed his Rakshasa form and with his last breath called out in a voice that perfectly mimicked Rama's own, crying for help in words that seemed to come from the prince himself in desperate distress. The sound carried through the forest on the wind, reaching Panchavati, where Sita heard it and immediately panicked, convinced that Rama was in mortal danger and needed assistance. She urged Lakshmana to go immediately to his brother's aid, but Lakshmana, remembering Rama's explicit instructions and suspecting that this cry was part of the trap he had warned about, refused to leave his post, explaining that Rama could handle any threat and that the cry was most likely a trick designed to accomplish exactly what was happening, to make them abandon the defensive position Rama had established. Sita, in her fear and frustration, spoke words she would later regret, accusing Lakshmana of having ulterior motives for wanting Rama to be harmed, suggesting that he hoped to take Rama's place in various ways once his brother was gone, casting aspersions on Lakshmana's character that were entirely unjust but that served to force his hand. Lakshmana, wounded by these accusations from someone he had served faithfully for years, finally yielded. But before leaving, he drew a protective circle around the hut with the tip of his bow, creating a magical boundary that he told Sita she must not cross under any circumstances, for within that circle no harm could reach her, but if she stepped outside it, she would be vulnerable. As soon as Lakshmana departed, Ravana made his approach, but he did not come as a demon king in all his terrible glory. Instead, he assumed the form of a wandering sage, a holy man in saffron robes carrying a begging bowl, his appearance designed to evoke trust and respect rather than fear. He came to the edge of the protective circle that Lakshmana had drawn and called out for alms, requesting food as was his right under the sacred customs that required householders to provide for mendicants and holy men. Sita, alone and already frightened by what she thought had been Rama's cry for help, hesitated, uncertain whether she should respond to this request or remain within the protected space as Lakshmana had instructed. The customs of hospitality were strong, however, deeply ingrained through years of palace upbringing, where turning away a Brahmin or sage was considered one of the gravest sins, and she decided that surely she could step just beyond the circle long enough to offer food to this holy man, that the danger Lakshmana had warned about must lie elsewhere rather than in this harmless-looking ascetic. The moment Sita crossed the protective boundary, Ravana dropped his disguise and revealed himself in his true form, 10 heads and 20 arms, his appearance so overwhelming that she froze in shock and terror. Before she could react or cry out, he seized her and lifted her into his flying chariot, a vehicle that could move through the air as easily as across the ground, powered by supernatural forces that responded to his will. Sita screamed and struggled, calling out for Rama and Lakshmana, fighting with all her strength, but against Ravana's power, she was as helpless as a child against an adult. The chariot rose into the air and turned southward, carrying her away from Panchavati at tremendous speed, the landscape below blurring as they flew high above the forest canopy. In her desperation, Sita managed to pull some of her jewelry loose and drop it, hoping that these items might serve as markers that Rama could follow. And she also called out to the trees and rivers they passed, to the birds and animals, asking them to bear witness to her abduction and to tell Rama which direction she had been taken. As they flew over a mountain, Sita saw far below a group of figures that she recognized as Vanaras, beings that were part monkey and part human, members of a forest-dwelling civilization that existed parallel to the human kingdoms. Among them was one of massive size who appeared to be a king or chieftain, and Sita threw down her remaining jewelry toward him, hoping that somehow these items might reach Rama and provide evidence of her fate. The Vanara king, named Vali, and his companions looked up as the golden chariot passed overhead, too high for them to intercept, but close enough that they could see the struggle occurring within it, and they marked the direction of flight and remembered what they had witnessed. The journey to Lanka took most of a day, flying over the breadth of southern India and across the strait that separated the island from the mainland, and when they finally descended, it was to a palace of such magnificence that even in her distress, Sita could not help but notice its beauty. Golden walls rising high, gardens filled with exotic flowers, halls supported by pillars carved from single gems, every surface decorated with artistry that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and refined taste. Ravana brought her to a section of the palace set aside for his wives and queens, a complex of buildings arranged around courtyards where fountains played and peacocks wandered, where every comfort imaginable was available, and where attendants waited to fulfill any request. He spoke to her then, not as a captor to a prisoner, but as a suitor to a reluctant bride, explaining that he had brought her here because her beauty deserved a setting more magnificent than a forest hut, that she should be queen of the greatest kingdom in the world, rather than the wife of an exiled prince living in poverty and hardship. He promised her everything: wealth and power, palaces and servants, freedom to pursue any interest or desire, asking only that she accept him as her husband and forget the life she had left behind. His speech was eloquent, delivered with genuine passion, for Ravana's feelings were as real as his methods were reprehensible, and he truly believed that he was offering Sita something vastly superior to what she had possessed, unable to understand that her commitment to Rama was not based on his status or his possessions, but on bonds that went deeper than any material consideration. Sita rejected him with a firmness that allowed no ambiguity, making clear that she was Rama's wife and would remain so regardless of circumstances, that no luxury could tempt her to abandon her marriage vows, and that she would rather die than accept Ravana as her husband. She spoke with a courage that surprised even herself, facing this powerful demon king without visible fear, drawing strength from her devotion to Rama and her certainty that he would come for her, that somehow he would find a way to reach even this island fortress and to take her back. Ravana, unused to rejection and confused by her refusal to see the advantages of his offer, tried various approaches, alternating between persuasion and threats, but Sita remained unmoved, and eventually he left her in the garden where he had brought her, placing Rakshasa women as guards to watch over her and prevent any escape attempt, but giving orders that she was not to be harmed or molested, that she was to be given time to reconsider her position and to come to appreciate what he was offering. Sita sat in the beautiful garden, surrounded by luxury but utterly alone, separated from everything she loved by hundreds of miles of land and ocean, with no way to send word to Rama of where she was, or even whether she still lived, and for the first time since the exile began, she felt truly helpless, caught in a situation where her own actions could accomplish nothing, and where she could only wait and hope that somehow, against all probability, rescue would come. Rama, returning to Panchavati, after killing Maricha and realizing the cry for help had been a deception, found Lakshmana rushing toward him through the forest, and the moment he saw his brother's face, he knew that something terrible had occurred. Lakshmana explained through gasps for breath what had happened, how Sita had heard the false cry and insisted he go to Rama's aid, how he had tried to refuse but been forced by her accusations to abandon his post, and how when they reached the hut together they had found it empty, the protective circle broken, signs of struggle evident in the disturbed earth and scattered belongings. The two brothers searched the immediate area desperately, calling Sita's name, examining every trace and track, finding evidence that pointed to an aerial departure, but providing no clear indication of direction or destination. Rama's grief, when the full realization settled upon him, was terrible to witness. A grown man and warrior reduced to weeping and calling out to the trees and rivers, asking if they had seen where his wife had been taken. His composure shattered by a loss that struck at the very foundation of his being. They began a search that would take them across a vast expanse of southern India, travelling without clear destination, questioning every hermit and forest dweller they encountered, following rumours and slim leads, their desperation growing with each day that passed, without finding any solid trace of Sita's whereabouts. The search took them eventually to the mountain region where the Vanaras dwelled, and it was there, near the cave of a dying Vanara chieftain, that they found the first real evidence of what had happened. The Vanara, whose name was Vali, lay wounded from a recent battle with his brother Sugriva over the kingship of their people, and scattered around him were pieces of jewellery that Rama recognized immediately as Sita's, the ornaments she had worn in the forest, now lying in the dust of a mountain cave thousands of miles from Panchavati. Vali, in his final moments, told them that he had seen a golden chariot flying southward high above the mountains, that a woman inside had been struggling and crying out, and that she had thrown down jewelry that had landed near where he and his companions stood, unable to help because the chariot was too high and moving too fast for even the greatest of Vanaras to reach. This information, fragmentary as it was, gave Rama something he had lacked until that moment: a direction, a sense that Sita had been taken south toward the ocean and perhaps beyond it. He and Lakshmana continued their journey southward, and as they travelled they became aware that they were being watched and followed by Vanaras, who moved through the trees with silent grace, observing but not yet approaching. Eventually, one of these watchers revealed himself, descending from the branches to stand before them on the path, and when Rama saw him clearly, he recognized a being of unusual presence and dignity, larger and more powerful than the common Vanaras they had glimpsed at a distance, with a face that combined intelligence and strength in equal measure. This was Hanuman, son of Vayu, the wind god, a warrior and scholar who served as minister to Sugriva, the Vanara prince who had lost his kingdom to his brother Vali and now lived in exile with a small band of loyal followers. Hanuman approached with respectful salutations, speaking in perfect Sanskrit that revealed an education far beyond what one might expect from a forest dweller, and he inquired about their purpose in travelling through this remote region, what they sought and whether he might offer assistance. Rama, sensing in this Vanara an ally of exceptional quality, told him the full story of their exile and of Sita's abduction, and Hanuman listened with deep attention, his expression showing both sympathy for their plight and a growing recognition that this meeting might serve purposes larger than any of them yet understood. He told them about Sugriva's situation, how the Vanara prince had been driven from his kingdom by his brother Vali after a misunderstanding during a battle with a demon, how Sugriva now lived in fear on this mountain because Vali had sworn to kill him if he ever left its boundaries, and how Sugriva desperately needed help to reclaim his throne and reunite his scattered people. Hanuman proposed an alliance that would serve both parties' interests. If Rama would help Sugriva defeat Vali and regain the Vanara kingdom, then Sugriva would mobilize his entire people to search for Sita, deploying thousands of Vanaras across the southern regions to locate where she had been taken and to provide whatever assistance Rama needed to rescue her. The proposal was practical and straightforward, offering Rama something he desperately needed, which was information and allies in a region where he had neither, while giving Sugriva the military support necessary to challenge his brother's superior strength. Rama agreed immediately, and Hanuman led them to the cave where Sugriva lived in hiding with his closest advisors, and there the formal alliance was sealed with oaths and promises that bound both parties to see the arrangement through, regardless of difficulties that might arise. The challenge of dealing with Vali, however, was not straightforward, for the Vanara king possessed a boon from the gods that gave him a unique advantage in combat. Whenever he faced an opponent in single battle, half of that opponent's strength would flow to Vali, making him effectively unbeatable in any fair fight. Sugriva had experienced this firsthand and knew that he could not prevail against his brother through normal combat, and Rama, understanding the situation, proposed a strategy that would level the field. He would hide in the forest with his bow, while Sugriva challenged Vali to single combat, and when the two brothers were engaged, Rama would shoot Vali from concealment, ending the fight before Vali's supernatural advantage could come into play. The plan was pragmatic but ethically complex, for it involved striking from hiding rather than facing an opponent openly, and Rama wrestled briefly with the dharmic implications before concluding that Vali, by abusing his power and unjustly exiling his brother, had forfeited the right to a warrior's death in fair combat. The challenge was issued, Sugriva emerging from his mountain sanctuary to call Vali out, and the Vanara king, enraged that his exiled brother dared to show himself, came roaring from the city to engage in battle. The two brothers fought with the fury of wild animals, grappling and striking with tremendous force, their struggle shaking the ground and sending smaller Vanaras fleeing for safety. Rama, positioned in the forest with his bow drawn, found that he could not shoot because the two combatants looked so similar that he could not be certain which was Sugriva and which was Vali. And the fight continued until Sugriva, badly wounded, broke away and fled back to his mountain refuge, the first attempt having failed because of this unforeseen complication. Sugriva recovered from his wounds and prepared to challenge Vali again, this time wearing a garland of flowers that would identify him clearly, and when the brothers met in combat for the second time, Rama was able to distinguish his target, and he loosed an arrow that struck Vali in the chest, the powerful shaft piercing even the Vanara king's supernatural defenses. Vali fell, mortally wounded, and in his final moments he spoke to Rama with a mixture of acceptance and reproach, understanding that he had been killed in a manner that violated conventional warrior codes, but also acknowledging that his own actions had created the situation that led to this end. He asked Rama to look after his son Angada and to ensure that Sugriva ruled justly, and then he died with the dignity that befitted a king, whatever his faults had been. Sugriva was crowned as the new Vanara king in a ceremony that combined grief for the fallen monarch with celebration of new leadership, and once the mourning period had been observed and the political transition completed, he fulfilled his promise to Rama by mobilizing the entire Vanara nation to search for Sita. Messengers were sent in all four directions, north and south, east and west, with instructions to search every kingdom and forest, every mountain and valley, until they found evidence of where the missing princess had been taken. The search parties returned one by one over the following weeks, those who had gone north and east and west reporting that they had found nothing, no trace of Sita or of the golden chariot that had carried her away. Only the southern party had not yet returned, led by Hanuman and including Angada, Vali's son, who had sworn loyalty to Sugriva and to the alliance with Rama. This party had travelled further than the others, pushing to the very edge of the continent where the land gave way to the ocean, a vast expanse of water stretching to the horizon with no visible land beyond. They searched along the coast desperately, questioning fishermen and coastal dwellers, but found no information about a woman being carried by in a flying chariot, and they began to despair of completing their mission, knowing that returning to Sugriva without information would be seen as failure and might result in severe punishment. As they sat on the beach in dejection, an enormous vulture named Sampati, brother to Jatayu, who had died trying to save Sita from Ravana's chariot, approached them and asked why they spoke of his brother. When they explained their mission and mentioned that Jatayu had died fighting Ravana, Sampati told them something that changed everything. He had seen the golden chariot from his mountaintop perch, had watched it fly southward across the ocean toward Lanka, Ravana's island fortress that lay 100 leagues beyond the coast, hidden from ordinary sight by supernatural defences, but visible to those with keen enough vision. Sampati described Lanka's location and the fact that Sita was almost certainly being held there, imprisoned by Ravana, who had desired her for his own, and who now kept her in his palace, hoping to break her will and make her accept him as her husband. The information solved one mystery, but created another enormous problem, for how were they to cross 100 leagues of ocean to reach an island fortress defended by one of the most powerful beings in the world, guarded by armies of Rakshasas and protected by magical barriers that prevented casual approach? The Vanara search party sat on the beach looking out at the endless water, discussing various impossible schemes, until finally attention turned to Hanuman, who had said little during these debates, but whose reputation as the son of the wind god suggested capabilities that might exceed those of common Vanaras. They asked him directly whether he could make the leap across the ocean to Lanka, and Hanuman, who had lived much of his life without fully recognizing his own powers, having been cursed as a youth to forget his abilities until someone reminded him of them, began to remember what he was capable of when his strength and his divine heritage were fully activated. He withdrew to a nearby mountain, the peak of Mahendra that rose high above the coastal plain, and there he performed austerities and meditations that brought his full powers to the surface, growing in size until he stood as tall as a small mountain himself, his form blazing with energy that made the air around him shimmer with heat. The other Vanaras watched in awe as Hanuman prepared himself for the great leap, and when he was ready, he crouched low and then sprang into the air, launching himself southward across the ocean with such force that the mountain he had pushed off from sank slightly into the earth. He flew through the sky like a meteor, his trajectory carrying him high above the waves. And as he travelled, he passed various obstacles, a mountain that rose from the ocean, attempting to block his path, but which he acknowledged politely and continued over, and a Rakshasa who lived in the water and tried to swallow him, but whom he defeated by expanding to enormous size and then shrinking again so quickly that the demon could not adjust, and he could pass through her mouth and out again without being caught. The flight took most of a day, and as evening approached, Hanuman saw Lanka rising from the ocean ahead, the golden city exactly as Sampati had described it, its walls glowing in the setting sun, its towers and temples reaching toward the sky with a splendor that rivaled anything the gods had built in their celestial realms. He reduced his size as he approached, shrinking down to something closer to his normal form so that he could move through the city without drawing attention, and he entered Lanka at night when the streets were quieter and the guards less alert. The city was enormous, far larger than any Vanara settlement, with wide boulevards and elaborate mansions, markets and temples, gardens and palaces, all built on a scale and with a richness that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and the labour of countless artisans. Hanuman moved through the streets like a shadow, searching for some sign of where Sita might be held, and his search eventually brought him to the palace complex at the heart of the city, a vast compound surrounded by high walls with guards posted at every gate. He scaled the walls after dark and began exploring the palace grounds, moving from building to building, peering through windows into rooms where Rakshasa women slept, or where treasures beyond counting lay stored in guarded chambers. He saw Ravana's wives in their quarters, each one beautiful in different ways, surrounded by luxuries and attended by servants, but none of them was Sita. He was beginning to wonder whether Sampati's information had been wrong, whether Sita was being held somewhere else, when he noticed a garden set apart from the main palace buildings, a grove of Ashoka trees whose branches hung low over a small clearing, and in that clearing, sitting on the bare ground beneath one of the trees, wearing simple garments and looking thin and worn from her ordeal, he saw a woman who could only be Sita based on the descriptions Rama had given. Hanuman observed her carefully from hiding, noting the Rakshasa women who guarded the garden's perimeter, seeing how Sita sat with her eyes closed in meditation or prayer, her lips moving silently as if repeating mantras or calling on the gods for assistance. He needed to make contact with her, to let her know that Rama had sent help and that rescue was being planned, but he also needed to do so without alerting the guards or causing Sita to react in ways that would draw attention. He waited until deep night when even the Rakshasa guards had grown drowsy, and then he descended from the tree where he had been hiding, approaching Sita quietly and speaking her name in a whisper. She startled, looking up to see a Vanara standing before her, and her first reaction was fear that this might be another trick or some new torment devised by Ravana, but Hanuman quickly identified himself, explaining that he was Rama's messenger, that he had come from the mainland after an alliance had been formed between Rama and the Vanara king Sugriva, and that Rama was even now preparing to come to Lanka to rescue her. As proof of his identity and his mission, Hanuman produced a ring that Rama had given him to carry. A simple gold band that Sita recognized immediately as the one she had seen on Rama's finger every day of their marriage. And seeing this physical link to her husband, held by this strange messenger who had somehow crossed an ocean to reach her, Sita felt hope flood back for the first time since her abduction. She spoke with Hanuman at length, keeping her voice low so as not to wake the guards, asking about Rama and Lakshmana, learning about the events that had occurred since her capture, and gradually coming to trust this unusual Vanara, who seemed to carry within him a dignity and power that transcended his appearance. She gave Hanuman a jewel from her hair as a token to carry back to Rama, proof that Hanuman had truly found her and that she was alive, and she asked him to tell Rama that she was waiting and that her devotion to him remained unchanged despite all that had happened. Hanuman, having completed the primary objective of locating Sita and making contact with her, might have left immediately to carry this news back to Rama, but he decided that as long as he was in Lanka, he might as well gather more information about the city's defences and perhaps create some disruption that would serve the larger purpose of the coming war. He left the garden and began exploring the city more systematically, noting the locations of armories and guard posts, observing the routines of patrols, and generally gathering intelligence that would be useful when Rama eventually brought an army to Lanka's shores. As dawn approached and he prepared to leave, he decided to make his presence known in a way that would send a clear message to Ravana about what was coming, a demonstration that would shake the Demon King's confidence and let him know that his enemies possessed capabilities he might have underestimated. Hanuman began his demonstration by revealing himself openly in the city, growing to enormous size so that he stood taller than the buildings around him, and then he began systematically destroying military installations and storehouses, pulling down watchtowers, smashing gates, and generally creating chaos that sent the Rakshasa guards scrambling to respond. The alarm spread quickly through Lanka, bells ringing from temples and guards rushing toward the disturbance, and within a short time Hanuman found himself facing hundreds of Rakshasa warriors who attacked with swords and spears and arrows, none of which could seriously harm him due to his divine heritage and the boons he had received. He fought his way through the city toward the palace, dealing with wave after wave of defenders, and eventually he was confronted by Indrajit, Ravana's eldest son, and a warrior of considerable power who had earned his name, which meant Conqueror of Indra, by once defeating the king of the gods in single combat. Indrajit wielded weapons blessed by the gods and knew mantras that could bind even divine beings, and after a fierce battle, he managed to entangle Hanuman in the coils of the Brahmastra, a celestial weapon that could not be resisted by any being once its power was invoked. Hanuman allowed himself to be captured, partly because struggling against the Brahmastra would have been futile, and partly because he was curious to see Ravana face to face and to deliver his message directly rather than leaving it to be inferred from the destruction he had caused. He was brought before Ravana in the great throne room of the palace, dragged in by guards who kept their weapons ready even though their prisoner was bound by supernatural forces that should have made physical restraints unnecessary. Ravana sat upon his throne surrounded by his ministers and generals, his 10 faces showing various expressions of anger and curiosity as he examined this Vanara, who had caused such havoc in his supposedly impregnable city. The Demon King demanded to know who Hanuman was and what authority or madness had led him to attack Lanka, and Hanuman, though bound and surrounded by enemies, spoke with a calm authority that commanded attention despite his position as a captive. He identified himself as the messenger of Rama, the Prince of Ayodhya, whose wife Ravana had abducted through trickery and cowardice, and he delivered a message that was both warning and ultimatum. Rama knew where Sita was being held, Hanuman said, and he was coming with an army to take her back and to punish those who had wronged her. If Ravana had any wisdom, he would return Sita immediately with full honours and apologies, acknowledging his crime and seeking whatever mercy Rama might be inclined to offer, for the alternative was war and the destruction of Lanka and everything Ravana had built over his long reign. The Demon King's ministers, who had heard of Rama's prowess in battle, and who understood that a warrior capable of defeating Kara's entire army single-handedly was not an enemy to be taken lightly, began to counsel negotiation and compromise, suggesting that perhaps returning Sita was the prudent course given the potential costs of the alternative. Ravana, however, was not inclined to prudence or compromise, his pride and his power having convinced him that he was beyond the reach of any human prince, regardless of that prince's abilities. He dismissed his minister's concerns and ordered that Hanuman be executed immediately as punishment for the destruction he had caused in the city. But one of his counsellors, Vibhishana, who was Ravana's younger brother and one of the few Rakshasas in Lanka who maintained some connection to dharmic principles, intervened to point out that killing a messenger violated ancient laws that governed warfare and diplomacy, that such an act would bring dishonour upon Ravana and his kingdom. Ravana grudgingly accepted this argument and changed his order, decreeing instead that Hanuman's tail should be set on fire, a humiliating punishment that would mark him as a defeated enemy without technically violating the protections accorded to ambassadors and messengers. Guards wrapped Hanuman's tail in oil-soaked cloth and set it ablaze, and Hanuman, freed from the Brahmastra's bonds once the focus of attention shifted to this new punishment, used the opportunity to escape, leaping from building to building across the city with his burning tail leaving a trail of flames wherever it touched. He deliberately sought out the most magnificent structures, the palaces and treasure houses, the military installations and storage depots, touching his flaming tail to their roofs and walls, and within a short time much of Lanka was burning, the fires spreading faster than the Rakshasa defenders could control them. The city that had gleamed with golden light in the sun now glowed with the red light of destruction, smoke rising in enormous columns that could be seen from the mainland, and Hanuman, having thoroughly demonstrated what even a single emissary could accomplish against Lanka's supposedly invincible defences, extinguished his tail in the ocean and leapt back across the strait to report to Rama. His return to the Vanara camp was greeted with celebration, for the search party that had travelled south had been gone for so long that some had feared they had perished in the attempt to reach Lanka. Hanuman reported everything he had learned, describing Lanka's layout and defences, confirming that Sita was alive and being held in the Ashoka Grove, and delivering her message and the jewel she had given him as proof of his contact with her. Rama, receiving this confirmation that Sita lived and that her location was now known, felt the crushing weight of uncertainty lift from his shoulders, though it was immediately replaced by the burden of planning what would need to be done to rescue her from an island fortress defended by one of the most powerful beings in existence. The challenge was immense, perhaps impossible by any normal calculation, requiring an army to cross 100 leagues of ocean, to assault a fortified city, and to defeat forces that included not only vast numbers of Rakshasa warriors, but also Ravana himself, whose powers rivaled those of gods. Sugriva pledged his entire Vanara nation to the effort, mobilizing tens of thousands of warriors who began gathering at the southern coast, preparing for a campaign unlike any their people had previously undertaken. Rama and Lakshmana trained alongside the Vanaras, teaching them tactics and coordinating their efforts, transforming what had been a loose collection of forest clans into something resembling an organized army capable of coordinated action. The greatest challenge remained the ocean itself, that vast expanse of water that separated them from their goal, and it was unclear how they would manage to transport an entire army across it until Rama decided to approach the ocean as if it were a sentient being, a deity to be petitioned and negotiated with rather than simply an obstacle to be overcome through force or cleverness. He sat on the shore in meditation for 3 days and 3 nights, fasting and performing rituals, asking the ocean to provide a path that would allow his army to cross, appealing to whatever sense of justice or cosmic order might move such an elemental force to intervene in mortal affairs. When the ocean did not respond after 3 days, when no path appeared and no answer came to his prayers, Rama's patience, tested beyond its limits by months of searching and the knowledge that Sita remained imprisoned while he sat on this beach unable to reach her, finally broke. He took up his bow and began shooting arrows into the water, each one carrying power enough to boil the sea and disturb its depths, and he declared that if the ocean would not help willingly, he would dry up its waters entirely and walk across its bed to reach Lanka, regardless of the destruction such an action might cause to all the beings who dwelt within the ocean's realm. The ocean, faced with this threat, and recognizing that Rama possessed the power to make good on it, manifested in physical form as an ancient figure rising from the waves, and spoke to Rama in a voice like surf on stone, explaining that he could not simply provide passage without compromising his own nature, which was to remain an obstacle between land masses, but that he could offer an alternative. Among the Vanaras was a craftsman named Nala, son of the divine architect Vishvakarma, who possessed inherited knowledge of how to build structures that would stand in any environment, and if Nala were to construct a bridge across the strait using materials provided by the ocean and blessed by Rama's presence, such a bridge would hold long enough for the army to cross. The ocean would ensure that the materials needed, stones and timber that would float when properly arranged, would be available in abundance along the shore, and Rama's divine nature would imbue the structure with stability that normal engineering could never achieve. Work began immediately on the bridge, thousands of Vanaras labouring day and night to move rocks and logs into position, following Nala's directions as he planned and supervised the construction with skills that seemed to come to him instinctively, inherited memories of his divine father's craftsmanship guiding his decisions. The bridge grew day by day, extending from the mainland out across the water toward Lanka, a causeway of massive stones and logs bound together by techniques that seemed to defy natural laws, materials that should have sunk instead floating and holding firm under the weight of the workers who moved across them, adding new sections to the leading edge. The construction became a race against time, for word had reached Ravana of what was happening, and he sent forces to harass the workers, Rakshasa warriors flying over the water to attack the Vanara labourers, but Rama and Lakshmana, positioned to provide covering fire, shot down these attackers before they could do serious damage to the construction effort. After 5 days of continuous labour, the bridge was complete, stretching from the mainland to Lanka's northern shore, a solid causeway wide enough for many warriors to walk abreast and strong enough to bear the weight of the entire Vanara army. The structure was not beautiful, built from rough materials by workers more concerned with function than aesthetics, but it was functional and it was complete, and its existence represented something that had never been accomplished before in the long history of the world, a means for a land-based army to assault an island that had always relied on the ocean as its primary defense. The Vanara forces gathered at the bridge's head, tens of thousands of warriors carrying primitive weapons, clubs and stones, and their own formidable strength, led by commanders who had trained for this moment and guided by a purpose that transcended normal military objectives, the rescue of an innocent woman and the punishment of one who had violated every code of honourable conduct. They crossed the bridge in massive columns that took most of a day to complete the passage, and as the last warriors reached Lanka's shore, they arrayed themselves in formations around the northern edge of the island, preparing for the siege that everyone knew would be brutal and costly. Rama sent Angada as an emissary to Ravana one final time, offering the Demon King a last chance to return Sita peacefully and to avoid the war that would otherwise follow. But Ravana, surrounded by his generals and his sons, all of them urging battle and confident in their strength, and their city's defences, rejected the offer with contempt, saying that no human prince with an army of monkeys would make him surrender anything, that Lanka had never fallen to any attacker in its long history, and that Rama would learn the cost of his presumption when the battle began. The war opened at dawn the next day, with Rakshasa forces pouring out of Lanka's gates to meet the Vanara army on the open ground north of the city, thousands of warriors on each side rushing toward each other with weapons raised and battle cries echoing across the landscape. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, Vanaras using their agility and their ability to leap great distances to compensate for the Rakshasas' superior weapons and armor, while the Rakshasas employed supernatural powers and coordinated tactics that they had refined through centuries of military practice. The battle raged through the day and into the night, illuminated by fires that burned across the field, and by the time dawn came again, both sides had suffered heavy casualties, but neither had gained decisive advantage. The Vanaras retreated to their positions, and the Rakshasas returned behind their walls, and both armies tended to their wounded and prepared for another day of fighting. The pattern repeated over the following days and weeks, massive engagements alternating with smaller skirmishes, heroes on both sides emerging to challenge each other in single combat while their armies watched and cheered, and slowly the advantage began to shift in favor of the attackers, not because the Vanaras were individually superior to the Rakshasas, but because Rama and Lakshmana provided leadership and tactical direction that transformed an undisciplined horde into an effective fighting force. They identified weak points in Lanka's defences, directed their forces to exploit them, and personally engaged the most dangerous Rakshasa champions, steadily reducing the enemy's strength while maintaining pressure that prevented Ravana from fully utilising his numerical advantages or the supernatural resources at his disposal. Key Rakshasa commanders fell in battle, some killed by arrows from Rama or Lakshmana, others overwhelmed by masses of Vanara warriors who learned to coordinate their attacks to bring down enemies too powerful for any individual to face alone. Ravana, watching his forces being gradually worn down, unleashed his most powerful weapons and warriors, sending forth his brother Kumbhakarna, a giant of enormous size and strength who had slept for 6 months at a time under a curse, but who, when awakened, was nearly unstoppable in battle. Kumbhakarna emerged from the city gates, standing as tall as the walls themselves, wielding weapons the size of tree trunks, and he waded into the Vanara army like a man walking through tall grass, crushing hundreds with each sweep of his arms, indifferent to the arrows and stones that bounced off his massive body. The Vanaras fell back in terror before this apparition, but Rama, seeing that conventional warfare would not stop such a being, engaged him directly with celestial weapons, divine arrows that carried power sufficient to wound even one so large and protected. And after a prolonged battle that destroyed acres of landscape and killed countless warriors on both sides, Rama finally brought Kumbhakarna down, the giant falling like a toppled mountain, his death a blow to both Rakshasa morale and to Ravana personally, for Kumbhakarna had been not just a powerful warrior, but a brother who had always stood loyal despite disagreeing with many of Ravana's decisions. Indrajit, Ravana's son, who had once captured Hanuman, entered the battle next, flying in a chariot that could move unseen through the air, shooting arrows from concealment that struck without warning. He wounded both Rama and Lakshmana severely, using weapons that caused not just physical injury, but also spiritual distress, and for a time it seemed that the attackers might lose their leadership at this crucial juncture. The Vanara army fell into confusion and despair, seeing their commanders fallen and bleeding, but Hanuman, drawing on his divine nature and his devotion to Rama, flew across the strait and to a distant mountain where grew a magical herb called Sanjivani that could heal any wound and restore the dying to life. Unable to identify which specific plant was the healing herb, Hanuman simply tore the entire mountaintop free from its base and carried it back to Lanka, and the physicians who travelled with the Vanara army were able to find the Sanjeevani among the vegetation on that displaced mountaintop and use it to heal Rama and Lakshmana, bringing them back from the edge of death to full strength. The battle continued with renewed intensity, Indrajit now fighting openly since his concealed approach had failed to achieve decisive results, and he proved himself to be perhaps the most dangerous warrior the Rakshasas possessed, combining supernatural powers with tactical brilliance and weapons that few could withstand. The Vanaras suffered terribly under his attacks, but eventually Lakshmana, through a combination of skill and determination that pushed him beyond his normal limits, managed to isolate Indrajit from his supporting forces and engage him in single combat. The duel between them was prolonged and terrible, two warriors of exceptional ability testing each other to destruction, and in the end it was Lakshmana who prevailed, striking Indrajit down with an arrow that severed his head from his body, removing from the battlefield the last defender who might have turned the tide against the attackers. Ravana, learning of his son's death, felt something break within him. The accumulated losses of brother and son, and countless loyal warriors, finally overwhelming even his immense pride and his faith in his own invincibility. He prepared himself for battle with rituals and prayers, donning his finest armor and taking up weapons that he had not needed to use in centuries. And he rode out from Lanka's gates in his golden chariot, pulled by creatures that were part horse and part demon, his 10 faces grim with determination and grief. The armies on both sides fell back to create space for what everyone recognized would be the decisive engagement. The confrontation between the exile prince who had lost everything and the Demon King who was about to lose his kingdom, his family, and his life. The battle between Rama and Ravana began not with words or ceremonial challenges, but with Ravana loosing a volley of arrows that darkened the sky, hundreds of shafts flying simultaneously from his multiple arms, each one aimed with precision and carrying power enough to fell ordinary warriors with a single strike. Rama countered with his own arrows, shooting with such speed that individual motions blurred together into continuous action, and the shafts met in mid-air, Rama's intercepting Ravana's in bursts of light and force that sent shockwaves across the battlefield. The two warriors circled each other in their chariots, testing and probing, each looking for openings in the other's defense. And as they fought, the earth itself seemed to respond to the violence, trembling and splitting in places where particularly powerful weapons struck. The very elements becoming unstable under the pressure of forces that exceeded what the material world was meant to contain. Ravana employed weapons that had been gifted to him by gods during his years of austerity, celestial arms that could summon fire or wind, that could create illusions or multiply into thousands of copies, each one as deadly as the original. He sent serpent arrows that writhed through the air seeking Rama's flesh, and Rama countered with arrows carrying the essence of Garuda, the divine eagle who was the natural enemy of all serpents, and the two sets of weapons destroyed each other in bursts of supernatural energy. Ravana summoned torrents of water to drown his opponent, and Rama dispersed them with arrows that carried the sun's heat, turning water to steam that rose in clouds obscuring the battlefield. The Demon King created duplicates of himself through Maya, the power of illusion that he had mastered through long study, and Rama, seeing through the deception with perception that went beyond normal sight, shot only at the real Ravana, while ignoring the phantom copies that vanished as soon as they were struck. As the battle continued through the morning and into the afternoon, a pattern began to emerge. Ravana fighting with desperation and fury, drawing on reserves of power that he had accumulated through lifetimes of spiritual practice and divine favor, while Rama fought with a calm precision that never wavered, each action perfectly measured, each response exactly calibrated to counter whatever Ravana attempted. It was not that Rama was more powerful, though the power he commanded was certainly extraordinary, but rather that he fought without attachment to outcome, without the fear of death or the desire for victory that could create hesitation or error, and this fundamental difference in their states of mind began to manifest in the flow of combat. Ravana's attacks, though individually devastating, were driven by emotion, by rage at his losses and fear of what defeat would mean, while Rama's responses came from a place of stillness that allowed perfect adaptation to changing circumstances. The tide began to turn when Rama invoked the Brahmastra, the ultimate weapon that carried within it the creative power of Brahma himself, a force that could not be defended against by normal means, and that represented one of the most serious escalations possible in warfare between beings of great power. The arrow, once released, transformed into something that transcended physical form, becoming pure destructive potential that sought its target with inexorable certainty, and Ravana, recognizing what was coming toward him, countered with his own Brahmastra, the only defense against such a weapon being an equal weapon used in opposition. The two Brahmastras met in the space between the combatants and annihilated each other in an explosion of light and force that flattened everything within a considerable radius, throwing both warriors from their chariots and sending soldiers on both sides running for cover from the aftermath. Rama and Ravana rose from where they had fallen and continued fighting on foot, now wielding not just arrows, but also divine weapons of other types, maces and swords that had been blessed by gods and that carried properties beyond what physical objects should possess. They struck at each other with blows that would have shattered mountains, and each time Rama severed one of Ravana's heads with a particularly precise strike, another grew in its place. For Ravana's boon from Brahma included regeneration that made it nearly impossible to kill him through conventional means. Rama began to understand that simple destruction would not be sufficient, that he needed to strike at something deeper than Ravana's physical form if he was to end this battle, and he called upon the power that dwelt within him, the aspect of Vishnu that had incarnated in human form specifically to address the imbalance that Ravana represented in the cosmic order. As sunset approached, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that matched the fires burning across the battlefield, Rama took up a special arrow that had been given to him by Agastya, a great sage who had blessed the weapon with mantras and divine essence specifically for this moment. The arrow was called the Brahmastra of Brahma, and it was different from the weapon Rama had used earlier. Not merely a tool of destruction, but an instrument of cosmic justice, capable of piercing not just flesh, but the subtle body, the accumulation of karma and divine boons that protected Ravana and made him nearly invincible. Rama placed this arrow on his bowstring, drew it back with his full strength, and as he did so, the arrow began to glow with an inner light that grew brighter until it was almost painful to look at directly. And those watching from both armies knew that something final was about to occur, that this single shot would determine the outcome of everything that had come before. The arrow, when released, flew straight and true, cutting through the air with a sound like thunder mixed with divine music, and it struck Ravana in the chest directly over his heart, piercing through armor and flesh and bone, continuing through his body to emerge from his back, and as it passed through him, it destroyed not just his physical form, but also the spiritual protections that had kept him alive through countless battles and dangers. Ravana's multiple heads gasped in unison as the life fled from his body, and he fell backward onto the earth that he had ruled for so long, his 10 faces showing in their final moments, not rage or defiance, but something closer to relief, as if the burden of his power and his pride and his endless appetites had finally been lifted. The great Demon King lay still, his eyes glazing over, and across the battlefield a profound silence fell as both armies recognized that the war had reached its conclusion, that the conflict which had consumed so many lives and destroyed so much had finally ended with this single arrow that brought down a being who had seemed beyond the reach of mortality. Rama stood looking down at Ravana's body, and his expression showed not triumph or satisfaction, but rather a kind of sorrow. For Ravana, despite all his crimes and cruelties, had also been a being of exceptional abilities and learning, someone who might have accomplished great things if his path had been different. Vibhishana, Ravana's brother, who had defected to Rama's side earlier in the war after failing to persuade Ravana to return Sita peacefully, approached the fallen king and wept, and Rama comforted him with words acknowledging that even enemies could be mourned for their wasted potential and the tragedy of paths chosen unwisely. The proper funeral rites were performed for Ravana. For whatever his faults, he had been a king and a being of power, and such figures deserved the respect due to their station even after death had claimed them. The great pyre was built on the shore where the battlefield met the ocean, and as the flames consumed Ravana's body, releasing his spirit to continue whatever journey awaited beyond death, the citizens of Lanka emerged from behind their walls to witness the end of an era and to wonder what would come next for their city and their people. With the war concluded and Ravana dead, Rama's first thought was for Sita, who had remained imprisoned in the Ashoka Grove throughout the battle, guarded by Rakshasa women who had treated her with varying degrees of respect or contempt depending on their individual natures. Hanuman was sent to tell her that Rama had prevailed, that Ravana was dead, and she was free to leave her confinement, and Sita, hearing this news after so many months of captivity and uncertainty, felt emotions flood through her that she could barely name. Relief and joy mixed with grief for all that had been lost, and apprehension about what reunion with Rama would mean after such a long separation under such circumstances. She was brought from the grove to the main gate of the city where Rama waited, and as she approached, walking slowly with Hanuman at her side, and a crowd of Vanaras and Rakshasas watching from a distance, both she and Rama felt the weight of everything that had happened, the months apart, the war fought for her sake, the deaths of thousands of beings who had become caught up in the consequences of Ravana's desire and Rama's determination. The reunion, which should have been a moment of uncomplicated joy, was instead complicated by questions that hung unspoken in the air between them. Sita had been held captive in Ravana's palace for months, living in close proximity to a being who had desired her and who possessed the power to take whatever he wanted. And though Sita knew her own truth, that she had refused Ravana absolutely and had remained faithful to Rama in both deed and thought, she also understood that others might doubt, that the circumstances created an ambiguity that could never be entirely dispelled through mere assertion of innocence. Rama, seeing her approach, felt torn between the joy of having her back alive and safe, and the awareness that as a prince whose actions were watched and judged by kingdoms, and whose example would influence how Dharma was understood by future generations, he could not simply accept her return without addressing the questions that others would inevitably raise about what might have occurred during her captivity. He spoke to her with a coldness that shocked those who heard it, saying that he had fought the war and defeated Ravana to uphold his honor as a warrior and to punish an enemy who had committed an unforgivable offense, but that he could not take her back as his wife because she had lived in another man's house for too long and her purity had been compromised regardless of what had or had not actually happened. The words struck Sita like physical blows, and she stood silent for a long moment processing this rejection that came from the one person she had thought would understand her suffering and her faithfulness without needing proof or demonstration. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears flowing down her face, and she addressed not just Rama, but the assembled crowds of Vanaras and Rakshasas, asking that a pyre be built, saying that if her truth could not be seen directly, then fire would serve as witness and judge, for fire was the element that consumed impurity while leaving truth intact, and she would enter the flames to demonstrate once and for all that she had remained true to her marriage vows, despite all the temptations and threats that Ravana had employed. Lakshmana, horrified by what was unfolding and furious at Rama for allowing it to reach this point, moved to build the pyre with trembling hands. his face showing emotions he rarely permitted himself to express. And when the structure was complete and the flames were burning high, Sita walked toward it with the same dignity she had carried through all her trials, her head held high, her steps steady, and without hesitation she entered the fire, disappearing into the flames that rose even higher with her entry. The crowd gasped and cried out, some unable to watch, others unable to look away, and for a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, the fire burned bright and fierce, and then the flames parted as if pushed aside by an invisible hand, and from within them stepped Sita, untouched and unburned, accompanied by Agni, the god of fire himself, who manifested in physical form to declare before all witnesses that Sita was pure and innocent, that she had remained absolutely faithful to Rama throughout her captivity, and that anyone who doubted her after this demonstration was willfully blind to truth that had been made manifest through divine testimony. Rama, seeing Sita emerge from the flames and hearing Agni's declaration, fell to his knees before her and begged her forgiveness, explaining that he had never doubted her personally but had felt compelled to provide this public proof because his actions as a prince would be scrutinized by future generations who would use his example to judge similar situations, and that without such demonstration, the story of Sita's abduction might have been told in ways that cast doubt on her character and by extension on the validity of their marriage and the legitimacy of any children they might have. It was a political calculation wrapped in the language of Dharma, and whether it was justified or whether it represented a failure of Rama's wisdom and compassion was a question that would be debated by scholars and storytellers for thousands of years to come. Sita, who had passed through fire both literal and metaphorical, accepted his apology with a grace that exceeded what most humans could summon under such circumstances, and they were reunited at last, though something had been broken in that moment that perhaps could never be entirely repaired. The gods themselves appeared in the sky above Lanka, the major deities who had been watching these events unfold from their celestial realms, and they spoke to Rama, confirming what some had suspected and what Rama himself had perhaps known but never fully acknowledged, that he was not merely a human prince but an avatar of Vishnu, that the divine preserver had incarnated in mortal form specifically to remove Ravana from the world after the Demon King had grown so powerful and so arrogant that he threatened the balance of cosmic order. Ravana's boon from Brahma had made him invulnerable to gods and demons, but it had not extended to humans and animals, and so Vishnu had taken human form to accomplish what the gods themselves could not directly achieve. The exile from Ayodhya, which had seemed like a tragedy born from human weakness and manipulation, revealed itself to have been part of a larger pattern, a necessary movement that brought Rama to the forest where he would encounter Ravana's aggression and be positioned to respond to it in ways that would not have been possible if he had remained in the comfort and constraint of palace life. With Ravana dead and Sita recovered, the question arose of what should happen to Lanka, for the city could not be left without a ruler, and the Rakshasa people needed leadership that would guide them toward better choices than those Ravana had made. Vibhishana, who had opposed his brother's actions and who had aided Rama during the war, despite the personal cost of turning against his own family, was crowned as the new king of Lanka, taking up the burden of rebuilding a city that had been heavily damaged during the fighting and of leading a people who would need to adapt to new circumstances now that their previous king's power and ambition no longer shaped their destiny. Vibhishana pledged his friendship and alliance to Rama, and the two kingdoms, one in the north and one in the south, one of humans and one of Rakshasas, established bonds that would endure for generations, proving that even beings of different natures and histories could find common ground when guided by principles of justice and mutual respect. The 14 years of exile had now been completed, the term that Dasharatha had promised Kaikeyi fulfilled down to the day, and it was time for Rama to return to Ayodhya, to reclaim the throne that Bharata had been holding for him. Vibhishana provided a flying vehicle called Pushpaka, a chariot that had once belonged to Kubera, the god of wealth, before Ravana conquered it. And this vehicle could carry many passengers through the air at great speed, making the journey from Lanka to Ayodhya a matter of days rather than the months it would have taken by conventional travel. Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana boarded the Pushpaka along with Hanuman and several other Vanara leaders who wished to witness the coronation and to see the kingdom they had fought to restore to its rightful ruler. They flew northward over the landscape, and Rama pointed out to Sita the various places they had stayed during their exile, showing her from the air the path they had walked on foot, the mountains they had crossed, and the forests where they had lived, giving her an overview of those 14 years that transformed them from abstract memory into visible geography, a map of their journey that could be seen and comprehended as a whole rather than experienced only as a series of individual moments. As they approached Ayodhya, flying over the familiar territories where Rama had been raised and where he had expected to rule before exile had interrupted those plans, they could see changes in the landscape, new villages and expanded roads, irrigation systems that had been built during Bharata's regency, evidence that the kingdom had continued to develop and prosper even without Rama's direct presence. The city itself came into view, its walls and towers looking much as they had when Rama had left 14 years earlier. And as the Pushpaka descended toward the palace, crowds began to gather in the streets, word spreading that the exiled prince had returned at last, that the long wait was ending, and the rightful king was coming home to claim his throne and to reunite with the brother who had served as his regent through all the years of separation. Bharata came out to meet them before they even reached the palace, running through the streets with his hair still matted from the ascetic lifestyle he had maintained throughout the regency, his simple clothes marking him as someone who had fulfilled duty without claiming any of its privileges. And when he saw Rama descending from the Pushpaka, his face showed emotions too complex for easy naming. Joy at his brother's return, mixed with relief that the burden he had carried for 14 years could finally be set down, and perhaps also a trace of sorrow that this reunion marked the end of a period that, difficult as it had been, had given his life a clear purpose and meaning that would be harder to find once Rama took up the reins of actual kingship. The brothers embraced for a long moment, neither speaking, both understanding that words would be inadequate to express what had passed between them across the years of separation, the trust that Bharata had maintained, and the faith Rama had kept that his brother would indeed preserve the kingdom until the promised return. Bharata brought forth the sandals that he had placed on the throne 14 years earlier, the simple wooden footwear that had represented Rama's authority during all the time of regency, and he presented them to Rama formally, asking to be released from his duties and allowed to return to being simply a brother and a prince, rather than the acting king whose every decision had been made with the weight of temporary power that could never truly be claimed as his own. Rama accepted the sandals with equal formality, acknowledging Bharata's service and releasing him from obligations that few could have borne with such integrity, and then the entire company proceeded to the palace where preparations for coronation began immediately, for there was no reason to delay now that all the conditions that had prevented Rama's kingship had been fulfilled. The ministers and priests who had served Dasharatha and then advised Bharata through his regency now turned their attention to organizing a ceremony that would mark not just a change in rulership, but a transition from a period of waiting and uncertainty to one of legitimate and expected governance. The coronation took place during the spring festival, the same season when Rama's coronation had originally been planned 14 years earlier, before Kaikeyi's demands had interrupted those preparations, and the parallels were not lost on anyone who remembered that earlier time and the events that had flowed from it. The ceremony followed ancient patterns, rituals that connected this moment to the long chain of kings who had ruled Ayodhya since the city's founding, each gesture and each spoken verse carrying accumulated meaning from generations of repetition. Rama was anointed with water from sacred rivers brought from distant parts of the kingdom, symbolizing the unity of the realm under his protection, and he received the royal regalia, crown and scepter, and ornaments that had been worn by his father and grandfather and the long line of Ikshvaku kings before them. Vasishtha, who had survived to see this day despite his great age, performed the final blessings, his voice cracking with emotion as he proclaimed Rama as rightful king of Ayodhya and called upon the gods to witness and support this restoration of proper order. Sita was crowned as queen in a parallel ceremony, taking up the position that would have been hers 14 years earlier if circumstances had unfolded differently. And though she stood beside Rama with appropriate dignity and grace, those who knew her story could see in her eyes the distance that her experiences had created, a part of her awareness that remained always in the forest or in the Ashoka grove, never entirely returning to the comfortable certainties of palace life. Lakshmana was honoured for his service and his loyalty, given lands and titles that acknowledged his role in the exile and the war, though he asked for little and seemed content simply to remain near Rama, continuing to serve as he had always done, bound by affection and duty that transcended any formal obligations. Hanuman and the other Vanara leaders who had accompanied them from Lanka were received with full honours, treated as heroes and allies whose contributions had been essential to the victory, and though they stayed in Ayodhya only for the celebration before returning to their own lands, bonds of friendship had been forged that would connect the human and Vanara kingdoms for generations to come. The reign that followed, which later storytellers would call Ramrajya, the rule of Rama, became legendary as a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, a golden age when Dharma was upheld perfectly and when the kingdom flourished under wise and just governance. The rains came regularly, the harvests were abundant, trade expanded as roads became safer, and relationships with neighbouring kingdoms strengthened, and the people lived without fear of invasion or internal strife. Crime was said to be almost non-existent, not because punishments were harsh, but because the king's example inspired citizens to act righteously, and disputes were resolved fairly through courts that functioned without corruption or favouritism. The stories perhaps exaggerated the perfection of this period, for no human society can entirely escape the challenges that arise from conflicting interests and limited resources. But the basic truth remained that Rama ruled with wisdom and compassion, guided always by his understanding of Dharma and his commitment to the welfare of his subjects rather than his own aggrandizement. Yet even this golden age was not without its shadows, for the events of the exile and the war had set in motion consequences that would continue to unfold through the years of Rama's reign. The trial by fire that Sita had undergone to prove her purity had satisfied the assembled witnesses in Lanka, but rumours and doubts continued to circulate among some in Ayodhya who had not witnessed those events directly and who questioned whether a woman who had lived in a demon's palace could truly be accepted as queen without reservation. These whispers remained underground during the early years of the reign, suppressed by the general prosperity and the respect that most citizens felt for their king, but they never entirely disappeared, lurking in conversations that stopped when officials approached, in questions that children asked their parents about the Queen's story, in doubts that some harboured even while maintaining outward deference to royal authority. Sita gave birth to twin sons, Lava and Kusha, and their arrival seemed to promise continuity and the establishment of a dynasty that would carry forward the ideals their father had embodied. But the joy of their birth was complicated by the circumstances of their conception and the questions that some continued to raise about their mother's status. Rama, caught between his love for Sita and his sons and his responsibility to maintain a kingdom where his judgments would serve as precedents for how similar situations should be handled in future generations, found himself facing an impossible choice, and in a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and be debated by scholars for centuries to come. He chose to exile Sita once again, not because he doubted her, but because the persistent rumors threatened to undermine his authority and the stability of the kingdom, and because he believed that a king must be held to higher standards than ordinary citizens, that his household must be beyond any suspicion regardless of the personal cost. Sita, pregnant with the twins when the exile was imposed, was taken to the forest by Lakshmana, who carried out this duty with a heart heavy with grief and guilt, and she was left at the hermitage of Valmiki, the sage who would later compose the Ramayana itself, recording these events in verses that would be remembered and recited for thousands of years. Valmiki took Sita under his protection, providing shelter and care, and there in his ashram the twins were born and raised, learning the arts of warfare and scholarship, growing into young men who knew nothing of their royal heritage, but who carried within them the qualities that marked them as Rama's sons. Valmiki taught them the story of their parents, composing it as an epic poem that the boys memorized and could recite with perfect fluency, not knowing that the characters they spoke of were their own mother and father, that the tale of exile and war and reunion that moved listeners to tears was their family history rather than ancient legend. The years passed, and Rama ruled without Sita beside him, the palace that should have been full of family life, instead marked by an absence that everyone felt but few dared mention. Rama performed his duties with the same dedication he had always shown, but those close to him could see that something had broken inside him, that the second exile of Sita, necessary as he had believed it to be for the kingdom's welfare, had cost him something essential, and that he carried this loss with him through every day of his reign. Lakshmana remained loyal as always, but even his presence could not fill the void that Sita's absence created, and the brothers grew older together in a palace that felt more like a monastery than a home, dedicated to duty and service, but lacking the warmth that family connections might have provided. The twins, Lava and Kusha, grew to young manhood in Valmiki's ashram, and eventually they travelled to Ayodhya to perform at a great sacrifice that Rama was sponsoring, reciting the Ramayana that Valmiki had composed, their clear voices carrying through the assembled crowd as they told of Rama's exile, of Sita's abduction, of the war against Ravana, and of the reunion and the trials that followed. Rama, listening to his own story, told by these young men whose faces carried echoes of his own features, began to understand who they must be. And when Valmiki arrived at the ceremony and confirmed that these were indeed Rama's sons, born to Sita during her second exile and raised without knowledge of their father, the king felt the full weight of his choices settle upon him like a stone garment that he could never remove. He asked that Sita be brought to Ayodhya once more, not to exile her again, but to ask her forgiveness, to acknowledge publicly what he had done, and to beg her to return so that their family might be reunited and the wounds of separation finally healed. Sita came, but when she stood before the assembled court and was asked once again to demonstrate her purity, to undergo another public trial to satisfy those who still harboured doubts, she refused not with anger, but with a quiet dignity that carried more power than any protest could have wielded. She called upon the earth, her mother who had given her birth when Janaka's plough had found her in that furrow so many years ago, and she asked to be received back into the earth's embrace, to return to the source from which she had come, for she had endured trials enough and could bear no more of the suspicion and judgment that seemed to follow her, regardless of how many times she proved her innocence. The earth responded to her call, splitting open beneath her feet, and from the crack emerged a golden throne carried by Nagas, the serpent beings who dwelt in the underworld, and Sita sat upon the throne with the same composure she had maintained through all her trials, and the earth closed over her, taking her back, removing her from the world of human judgment and expectation, and leaving Rama standing alone before his assembled court, his hand stretched out toward the place where she had stood, his face showing a grief too deep for tears or words. The reunion he had sought was not to be. The reconciliation he had hoped for had come too late, and he understood then that some choices, once made, create consequences that cannot be undone, that Dharma, for all its clarity about right and wrong, sometimes demands prices that break those who try to follow it with absolute fidelity. Rama continued to rule for many years after Sita's departure, maintaining the prosperity and justice that had characterized his reign, but those who knew him could see that he was only going through the motions, fulfilling obligations without the engagement that had once made his rule genuinely inspired rather than merely competent. His sons, Lava and Kusha, eventually came to understand their heritage and took their places in the kingdom, becoming capable rulers who would one day succeed him, but the relationship between father and sons was marked by the absence that stood between them, by Sita's departure and the circumstances that had made it inevitable. The Golden Age continued on the surface, but beneath it ran currents of sadness and loss, a recognition that even the best of kings and the most dedicated adherents to Dharma were still human, still capable of mistakes and misjudgments, still vulnerable to the consequences of choices that had seemed right at the time, but whose costs became clear only later. In his final years, Rama made arrangements for succession, ensuring that the kingdom would continue to be governed wisely after his departure, and when he felt that his time in the world was complete, that his purposes had been fulfilled and his role in the cosmic drama had played out, he walked into the Sarayu river, the same sacred waterway that flowed past Ayodhya and that had witnessed his birth and his coronation and all the events of his long life. Lakshmana, who had never wanted to be separated from his brother, walked into the river at the same time, the two of them departing the mortal world together as they had faced so many challenges together during their years of exile and war. The river received them gently, and those watching from the shore reported seeing lights in the water. Divine presences come to escort these avatars back to the celestial realms from which they had descended, their time as humans complete, their influence on the world's story permanent even as their physical forms dissolved into elements and energy. The story of Rama and Sita, of Lakshmana and Hanuman, of exile and war, of devotion and duty, and the complex web of Dharma that bound them all, passed into legend, and then into something more than legend, becoming scripture and moral example. A tale told and retold in countless variations across the centuries and the miles, adapted to different cultures and contexts, but maintaining always its essential truths about the costs of righteousness and the pain of choices made in service of principles that transcend personal happiness. The Ramayana became one of the foundational stories of Indian civilization, recited in temples and homes, performed in festivals and rituals, studied by scholars and memorized by children. Its characters becoming archetypes that shaped how people understood loyalty and courage, love and sacrifice, justice and mercy. And so the tale comes to rest here, in these quiet hours, when night holds sway and the concerns of waking life have been set aside, when stories from the deep past can wash over consciousness like gentle waves, bringing not lessons that must be learned or morals that must be applied, but simply the sense of connection to something larger than individual existence, to patterns that have repeated through countless lives and countless ages. Rama walked his path through the forest and through the war and through the difficult years of kingship, guided always by his understanding of what duty required, and whether he chose rightly or wrongly in each moment is perhaps less important than the fact that he chose with integrity, that he faced each challenge with honesty about what he was doing and why, and that he accepted the consequences of his choices without complaint or evasion. Sita endured trials that no one should have to face, demonstrated purity that should never have needed demonstration, and in the end chose her own departure rather than submitting to another round of judgment and suspicion, her final act one of dignity and self-determination rather than passive acceptance of whatever others demanded of her. Lakshmana served with a devotion that went beyond duty to something more personal and more profound, sacrificing his own comfort and safety without hesitation or expectation of reward, finding meaning in service and companionship rather than in status or recognition. And Hanuman, the devoted servant of Rama, who leapt across oceans and carried mountains, who burned a city and yet remained humble, became in later traditions a figure of worship in his own right, representing the ideal of selfless devotion and the power that comes from complete dedication to a worthy purpose. The night deepens around us now, the air still and heavy with the weight of these old stories. And the journey that began in Ayodhya so long ago has brought us through forests and across oceans, through battles and reunions, through triumph and tragedy, and the slow accumulation of years that marks all mortal existence. Let these images settle like sediment drifting down through clear water, the golden city and the green forest, the bridge across the strait and the flames of Sita's trial, the exile that began with a promise and ended with a throne, and all the choices made along the way by beings who tried to live according to principles they believed in, even when those principles demanded more than they thought they could give. Rest now in the awareness that these patterns continue, that the questions Rama faced are still being asked and answered in different forms, and that the search for Dharma, for right action in complex circumstances, remains as relevant now as it was in that distant age when gods walked more openly among mortals, and when one prince's exile became a story that would echo through the ages. The tale is complete, and there is nothing more that needs to be said or understood tonight, only the gentle settling into sleep, into dreams, into the quiet spaces where consciousness rests and stories take root in the deep places of the mind where they will grow and unfold in their own time, in their own ways.